Hey everyone, and welcome back. If you're anything like me, you love the idea of escaping into nature, the crisp air, the towering trees, the feeling of being completely disconnected. Camping and hiking can be an incredible experience, a chance to recharge and reconnect with the wild. Get ready to hear a tale that will make you think twice before venturing too far off the beaten path. This is true camping and hiking was a deadly mistake. Buckle up, because this one is not for the faint of heart. Subscribe and turn on notifications if you dare. My name is Jake, and to say I've spent a fair bit of time treating the trails would be a monumental understatement. Hiking isn't just a hobby for me, it's in my blood, woven into the very fabric of who I am. My dad was an avid backpacker, and some of my earliest memories are following his sturdy boots through sun-dappled forests and along winding mountain paths. I've hiked the Appalachian Trail in sections, explored parts of the Pacific Crest Trail, and even braved some of the more challenging routes in the Rockies down in the States. I thought I'd seen it all, heard it all, felt it all when it came to the wilderness. But the Canadian Rockies, well, there's something else entirely. This trip was supposed to be a bit of a solo adventure, a chance to disconnect from the noise and chaos of city life and reconnect with the raw, untamed beauty of nature. I'd spent weeks poring over maps, meticulously planning my route through a less traveled section of Banff National Park. The images I'd seen online were breathtaking, towering. Snow-capped peaks piercing the azure sky, pristine turquoise lakes reflecting the surrounding grandeur, and vast, seemingly endless forests of pine and fir. I'd packed my trusty gear, stocked up on supplies, and set off with a familiar thrill of anticipation humming in my veins. The first few days were exactly what I'd hoped for. The scenery was even more spectacular in person, the air crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. I'd hiked for hours each day, pushing myself just enough to feel the satisfying ache in my muscles at night, but not so much that I couldn't enjoy the quiet solitude of my campsite. I'd seen the occasional deer or elk grazing peacefully in a meadow, even spotted a couple of marmots scurrying amongst the rocks. The sounds of the forest were the familiar symphony I'd come to expect. The gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze, the chirping of unseen birds, the distant rush of a mountain stream. But then on the fourth day, things started to feel different. It wasn't anything dramatic, no sudden storm or close encounter with a wild animal. It was more subtle, a gradual shift in the atmosphere that I couldn't quite put my finger on at first. It started with the bird song, or rather the lack thereof. Usually, the forest would be alive with their melodies, a constant chorus accompanying my trek. But that morning, as I broke camp and started along the trail, the woods were eerily silent. It was a heavy, oppressive silence, the kind that seems to swallow all other sounds whole. I initially shrugged it off. Maybe the birds were just taking a break, or perhaps the early morning chill had kept them hidden. But as the hours passed and the sun climbed higher in the sky, the silence persisted. It was unnerving. It felt like the very air was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, that the vastness and isolation of the mountains were starting to get to me. But the feeling of unease grew with each step I took. Later that day, I noticed something else. The usual sounds of the forest, the cracking of twigs underfoot, the whisper of the wind through the trees seemed muted, almost muffled. It was as if a thick blanket had been draped over the entire landscape, absorbing all the natural sounds. I found myself straining my ears, trying to hear something, anything that would break the oppressive quiet. But there was nothing, just the rhythmic crunch of my own boots on the dirt path and the sound of my own breathing, which suddenly seemed amplified in the unnatural stillness. As the day wore on, a prickling sensation began to creep up my spine. It was the feeling of being watched, the instinctive awareness that you're not alone, even when you can't see anyone else around. I'd stop every now and then, scanning the trees, my eyes searching for any sign of movement. But there was nothing, just the dense, silent forest stretching out in every direction. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe there were other hikers nearby moving silently off trail. Maybe it was just my nerves getting the better of me, the isolation playing tricks on my mind. But the feeling persisted, growing stronger with each passing hour. It wasn't just the silence, it was something else, something I couldn't quite articulate. It was a sense of wrongness, like the natural order of things had been subtly disrupted, leaving behind an unsettling void. That night I made camp earlier than usual. The silence of the forest after dark was even more profound, almost suffocating. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sounded deafening in the stillness. I built a larger fire than I normally would, the flickering flames casting dancing shadows on the surrounding trees, creating an illusion of safety in the encroaching darkness. I sat by the fire for hours, nursing a mug of hot tea, my senses on high alert. Every now and then, I thought I heard something, a faint rustling in the undergrowth just beyond the firelight. But when I'd shine my headlamp in that direction, there would be nothing there. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Every creak of a branch, every sigh of the wind through the trees sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. I kept waking up, my heart pounding in my chest, convinced I'd heard something moving just outside my tent. But each time when I peered out into the darkness, there was nothing to see. Just the silent, watchful trees in the cold, indifferent stars overhead. As the first hint of dawn began to paint the eastern sky, I felt a sliver of relief. The night had passed and nothing had happened. Maybe it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, fueled by the isolation and the unnatural silence. I packed up my gear quickly, eager to get moving, to put some distance between myself and the oppressive stillness of that campsite. But as I started down the trail, the silence returned, heavier and more profound than before. And then I noticed something else. A feeling, more than a sound, a subtle vibration in the air, like something large and heavy was moving nearby, just out of sight. I stopped, my hand instinctively reaching for the bear spray clipped to my backpack. I held my breath, listening intently, trying to pinpoint the source of the disturbance. The feeling intensified. It was like a pressure, a subtle pushing against my senses. And then, for just a fleeting moment, I thought I saw something. A flicker of movement in the dense undergrowth to my left. Something dark and indistinct, moving with a fluid, unnatural grace. I froze, my heart hammering against my ribs. I stared intently at the spot where I'd seen the movement, but there was nothing there now. Just the silent trees and the tangled vegetation. I told myself it was just a deer, or maybe a bear moving through the woods. But the feeling of unease lingered, stronger than ever. It wasn't just an animal. This felt different. This felt deliberate. I started walking again, my pace quickening, my eyes constantly scanning the trees. The feeling of being watched was almost palpable now, like invisible eyes boring into my back. I couldn't shake the sense that something was following me, moving silently through the undergrowth, keeping pace with me just out of sight. The silence continued, unbroken and oppressive. And in that silence, I began to realize that this wasn't just an ordinary hike in the Canadian Rockies. This was something else entirely, something unnatural, and I had a terrifying feeling that whatever was out there, in the silent woods, was slowly but surely closing in. The trail, which had been well marked and relatively easy to follow in the initial days, now seemed to twist and turn with a disorienting randomness. It was as if the very path itself was trying to lead me astray, deeper into the heart of this silent, watchful wilderness. The sun, usually a welcome companion, felt like an indifferent eye in the sky, offering no warmth or comfort against the growing chill that seemed to emanate from the woods themselves. I tried to push the feeling of being followed to the back of my mind. Focusing instead on the physical act of putting one foot in front of the other, I told myself that it was just stress and lack of sleep making me paranoid. Experienced hikers sometimes get spooked, especially when they're alone in unfamiliar territory. It's a natural response, a survival mechanism kicking in. But the rational part of my brain was losing ground to a more primal, instinctive fear that was tightening its icy grip around my chest. The unnatural silence was the worst of it. It was a constant, suffocating presence that amplified every small sound I did make. The crunch of my boots on the gravel, the rustle of my clothes, the frantic thumping of my own heart. It felt like I was walking through a vacuum, a void where the normal sounds of the forest had been inexplicably erased. I started to pay closer attention to my surroundings, examining every detail, trying to find some explanation for the oppressive stillness. The trees stood tall and unmoving, their branches heavy with silent needles. There was no breeze to rustle the leaves, no birdsong to break the quiet. Even the small streams I crossed seemed to flow with an unusual lack of sound, their waters gliding over the rocks without the familiar gurgling or splashing. I checked the map frequently, trying to reassure myself that I was still on the right track. But the familiar lines and symbols on the paper seemed strangely detached from the reality around me. The map showed trails, lakes, and landmarks that I expected to encounter, but the landscape itself felt alien, as if it had been subtly altered while I wasn't looking. As the morning wore on, the feeling of being watched intensified. It was no longer just a fleeting sensation. It was a constant, unwavering presence that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I would stop suddenly, whirl around, and scan the trees, but there was never anything to see, just the endless rows of silent pines and the shadows that seemed to stretch and distort in my peripheral vision. At one point, I thought I saw a flash of white through the trees. My heart leaped into my throat. A deer. A flash of sunlight. Or something else. I moved cautiously towards the spot, pushing through the dense undergrowth, my senses on high alert. But when I reached the clearing, there was nothing there. Just a patch of sunlight filtering through the leaves and the silent, watchful trees all around. I let out a shaky breath, trying to calm my racing pulse. I was starting to get spooked. The isolation, the silence, the feeling of being followed, it was all starting to wear on me. I needed to see another person, to hear a normal sound, to break this oppressive feeling of being utterly alone and surrounded by something unknown. Lunch was a hurried, uncomfortable affair. I sat with my back against a large rock, constantly looking over my shoulder, my ears straining for any sound that wasn't my own. I barely tasted the food, my appetite overshadowed by the gnawing anxiety that had taken root in my stomach. After lunch, the trail started to climb steeply, winding its way up a rocky hillside. The exertion helped to distract me for a while, forcing me to focus on my breathing and the placement of my feet. But as I reached the crest of the hill and started down the other side, the silence returned with a vengeance, pressing in on me from all sides. And then I saw it. It was just a glimpse, a fleeting shadow moving between the trees about 50 yards ahead of me. It was tall and slender, too thin to be a bear or a deer. It moved with an unnerving fluidity, a silent grace that seemed unnatural. It was there for only a second, a dark shape against the backdrop of the forest, and then it was gone, swallowed by the dense foliage. This time I knew I hadn't imagined it. I had seen something that didn't belong. My blood ran cold. The fear that had been simmering beneath the surface finally boiled over. My heart pounded in my chest and my breath caught in my throat. I froze on the trail, my eyes darting around, trying to relocate the mysterious figure. But there was nothing, just the silent trees and the shadows playing tricks on my eyes. I stood there for a long moment, paralyzed by fear and indecision. Should I turn back? Try to retrace my steps? But the thought of going back through the miles of silent forest I had already traversed was even more terrifying. I decided to keep moving forward, but my pace was now much faster, almost a panicked jog. I gripped my trekking poles tightly in my hands, feeling a desperate need for some kind of weapon, however inadequate. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, sent a jolt of fear through me. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see that dark figure emerge from the trees. The sun began to dip towards the horizon, casting long, distorted shadows across the trail. The air grew colder, and the silence of the forest seemed to deepen, taking on a more menacing quality. The familiar beauty of the wilderness had been replaced by a sense of lurking dread, an overwhelming feeling that I was no longer alone in this vast, silent expanse. As dusk began to settle, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, I knew I needed to find a place to camp for the night. But the thought of spending another night in this silent, haunted forest filled me with a profound sense of dread. I finally found a small clearing near a dry creek bed. It wasn't ideal, but it was the best I could do with the fading light. I worked quickly, setting up my tent and gathering firewood, my movements jerky and fueled by nervous energy. The silence of the approaching night was heavy and oppressive, punctuated only by the frantic rhythm of my own breathing. Once the fire was crackling, casting a flickering circle of light in the encroaching darkness, I huddled inside my tent, the nylon walls offering little comfort against the growing sense of unease. I kept my headlamp on, shining it around the interior of the tent, half expecting to see something peering in at me. The hours crawled by. The fire eventually burned down to glowing embers, and the darkness outside my tent seemed to press in on me, thick and suffocating. Every sound, no matter how small, sent a jolt of fear through me. I lay there, tense and wide-eyed, listening to the unnatural silence of the Canadian night, wondering what was out there in the darkness watching me. Then I heard it. It was faint at first, a subtle rustling in the leaves just outside my tent. I held my breath, straining my ears, trying to distinguish it from the normal sounds of the forest at night. But then it came again, closer this time. A soft, almost hesitant footfall on the dry leaves. And then another. And another. Something was outside my tent. Something was moving around my campsite, and in the profound silence of the Canadian Rockies, every step sounded like a thunderclap. The soft footfalls outside my tent continued, circling my small campsite with a deliberate, almost curious rhythm. My breath hitched in my throat. Whatever was out there was close, very close. I fumbled for the small knife I kept tucked beside my sleeping bag, my hand trembling so violently I could barely grip the handle. The nylon of the tent wall offered no real protection, feeling as flimsy as tissue paper against whatever was lurking just beyond. I held my breath, straining to hear over the pounding of my own heart. The footfalls stopped just outside the entrance of my tent. I could feel a presence there, an unseen weight pressing against the thin fabric. Then a new sound, a slow, deliberate sniffing, right by the seam of the tent. It was a wet, animalistic sound, and it sent a fresh wave of terror coursing through me. This wasn't a deer or a bear. This was something else, something predatory. I squeezed my eyes shut, wishing I had a gun, a flare, anything more substantial than a small knife. The sniffing continued, moving slowly around the perimeter of the tent. I could almost feel the creature's presence, its cold, unseen eyes fixed on me through the thin nylon. Suddenly, the sniffing stopped. The silence returned heavier and more oppressive than before. Had it gone? Was it just toying with me? I didn't dare to move, afraid that any sound or movement would provoke it. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The silence outside was broken only by the frantic buzzing in my own ears. I lay there, rigid with fear, every muscle in my body tense, waiting for something to happen. Then I heard it again. A different sound this time, a soft scratching like claws dragging against the rough bark of a nearby tree. It was close, incredibly close, and it sent a shiver of pure terror down my spine. Whatever it was still there, watching me, waiting. The scratching stopped, and then came a sound that made my blood run cold. A low, guttural growl, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the very ground beneath me. It was a sound of pure malice, of hunger and intent. I knew then that I couldn't just lie there and wait. I had to do something, anything. With a surge of adrenaline, I unzipped the tent flap as quietly as I could and peered out into the darkness. My headlamp illuminated a small circle of light, revealing nothing but the silent trees and the undergrowth. But then my light caught something. Just at the edge of the beam, standing perfectly still, was a figure. It was tall and gaunt, its form elongated and unnatural. It was hard to make out details in the dim light, but I could see two glowing eyes fixed on me, burning with an eerie, malevolent intensity. It wasn't an animal I recognized. It was humanoid in shape, but too thin, too tall, its limbs too long and spindly. Its skin seemed pale, almost translucent, and its face was obscured by shadow. But those eyes, those piercing, glowing eyes, I would never forget them. A low growl rumbled from its chest, and it took a slow, deliberate step towards me. Fear lent me a burst of energy. I scrambled out of the tent, clutching my knife, my mind racing. I had to get away. I turned and ran, plunging into the darkness of the forest, the beam of my headlamp bouncing wildly ahead of me. I didn't know where I was going. I just ran, fueled by pure terror. The image of those glowing eyes burned into my mind. I could hear it behind me, moving silently through the undergrowth, keeping pace with me with an unnatural speed and agility. I dared a quick glance over my shoulder and saw it again. That tall, gaunt figure gliding through the trees, its glowing eyes never leaving me. The silence of the forest seemed to amplify my frantic breathing and the pounding of my feet on the forest floor. I expected to hear it crashing through the undergrowth behind me, but it moved with an eerie quiet, its footfalls barely disturbing the fallen leaves. I stumbled and fell, scrambling to my feet and continuing to run, my lungs burning, my legs aching. I could feel it getting closer, the pressure of its unseen presence bearing down on me. Then I broke out of the trees and into a small clearing. In the distance, I could see a faint light, a beacon of hope in the overwhelming darkness. I ran towards it with renewed determination, pushing myself harder than I thought possible. As I got closer, I realized it was a small, isolated cabin. Smoke curled from its chimney, and a warm glow emanated from its windows. I stumbled towards the door, my hand outstretched, banging on it with all my might. "Help! Please help me!" I screamed, my voice hoarse and cracking. The door creaked open, and an elderly woman with kind eyes and a worried expression peered out at me. "What in heaven's name?" she began. Before she could say another word, the figure emerged from the trees behind me. It stood at the edge of the clearing, its glowing eyes fixed on us. The old woman gasped, her eyes widening in terror. She didn't say a word, but she grabbed my arm and pulled me inside, slamming the door shut and locking it. We stood there in the dimly lit cabin, panting, listening to the silence outside. The old woman held a trembling hand over her mouth, her eyes darting towards the windows. "What was that thing?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The old woman shook her head, her face pale with fear. "I don't know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've lived here my whole life, and I've never seen anything like it." We stayed in the cabin until dawn, huddled together in fear, listening to the silence outside. When the sun finally rose, painting the sky with hues of pink and gold, we cautiously opened the door and looked out. The clearing was empty. The figure was gone. But the silence of the Canadian Rockies remained, heavy and oppressive, a chilling reminder of the terror of the night before. The old woman helped me contact the park rangers, who launched an investigation. But they found nothing. No tracks, no signs of the creature I had seen. They chalked it up to hallucination, the result of stress and exhaustion. But I know what I saw. I know what stalked me through the silent woods. And I know I will never forget those glowing eyes, burning in the darkness. I left the Canadian Rockies as soon as I could, and I haven't been back since. I still hike. The trails still call to me, but I can never shake the memory of that trip, the unnerving silence, and the feeling of being watched by something ancient and unknown. Sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet, I think I can still hear it, the soft footfalls on the leaves, the wet, animalistic sniffing, the low, guttural growl echoing through the silence. And I know with a chilling certainty that something is still out there, in the vast, silent wilderness, waiting. My name is Sarah, and if there's one constant in my life, one unwavering tradition etched into the very fabric of my being, it's our annual family camping trip to Banff National Park. From the time I was a little kid, barely tall enough to peer over the picnic table, those towering, jagged peaks, the turquoise glacial lakes, and the dense, whispering forests have been my summer playground. We've hiked countless trails, roasted marshmallows under a sky bursting with more stars than I could ever count, and told the same slightly corny ghost stories around crackling campfires year after year. It's always felt like coming home, a comforting return to a place of pure, unadulterated natural beauty. This year, however, a subtle unease has been clinging to me, like the persistent mosquitoes that buzz around dusk. It started even before we left our driveway back in Calgary. Usually, the anticipation for this trip bubbles up weeks in advance, filling our house with a tangible excitement. We'd pore over maps, argue playfully about who got the window seat, and Mom would meticulously pack our camping gear, a well-rehearsed ritual that always ended with a triumphant, "And that's everything." This time, though, the preparation felt muted. There was a quietness in the air, a lack of the usual boisterous energy. Even my younger brother, Ethan, who usually can't sit still for 5 minutes, seemed strangely subdued. The drive itself, usually filled with singing along to the radio and pointing out landmarks we recognized, was similarly quiet. The familiar scenery of the Trans-Canada Highway unfolded before us, the rolling foothills giving way to the majestic Rockies. But the usual sense of wonder felt slightly off. Maybe it was just me, I thought. Maybe I was just in a weird mood. But the feeling persisted, a nagging little voice in the back of my mind whispering that something was different. When we finally arrived at our usual campsite, nestled beside the Bow River, the feeling intensified. It wasn't anything dramatic, no obvious sign of trouble. In fact, everything looked exactly as it always did. The familiar scent of pine needles and damp earth hung in the air. The river gurgled its familiar song, and the late afternoon sun dappled through the leaves, casting long shadows on the forest floor. But there was an undercurrent, a subtle shift in the atmosphere that I couldn't quite put my finger on. The other campsites around us were filling up, a mix of families, couples, and solo adventurers, all seemingly eager to immerse themselves in the wilderness. There was the usual chatter and laughter as tents were erected and gear was unpacked. But even that felt a little hollow somehow, like the sounds were just echoes, lacking their usual vibrancy. As we started setting up our own camp, the usual easygoing rhythm felt disrupted. Dad fumbled with the tent poles, something he's done 100 times before, and Mom kept double, checking the packing list, as if she expected to find something missing Ethan, instead of immediately running off to explore the riverbank, as he usually does, stayed close, kicking at loose pebbles with a worried frown on his face. Something feels weird, right? He asked me quietly as I wrestled with a stubborn tent peg. I glanced at him surprised. Yeah, I admitted. I've been feeling it too. Like something's watching us, he whispered, his eyes darting towards the dense tree line. I tried to dismiss his unease as childish imagination. It's just the woods, Ethan. Lots of animals around. But even as I said the words, a shiver ran down my spine. There was a weight to the silence between the usual sounds of the forest, the chirping of birds, the rustling of leaves, a stillness that felt unnatural. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the towering peaks, painting the sky in hues of orange, pink, and purple, we built our campfire. The flames danced merrily, casting flickering shadows that stretched and twisted the familiar shapes of the surrounding trees into something almost grotesque. We ate our hot dogs and s'mores, but the usual lively conversation was replaced by a more subdued murmur. Even Dad, who usually has a story for every occasion, seemed lost in thought, his gaze often drifting towards the dark woods beyond the firelight. After dinner, as the darkness deepened and the stars began to emerge, we gathered around the fire for our traditional ghost stories. Usually, this is my favorite part of the trip. We'd take turns telling tales of mythical creatures said to roam the park, of hikers who got lost and were never seen again, their stories embellished with dramatic flair and punctuated by nervous laughter. But tonight, the usual thrill felt different. The stories seemed to hang heavier in the air, the darkness beyond our circle of light feeling less like an empty void and more like a tangible presence. Mom told the old story about the phantom hitchhiker on the Icefields Parkway, a woman in white who disappears without a trace from the back seats of unsuspecting tourists' cars. Dad recounted the legend of the Mishipeshu, a powerful and dangerous water spirit said to inhabit the depths of Lake Minnewanka. Even Ethan, emboldened by the flickering firelight, chimed in with a story he'd heard at school about a group of campers who stumbled upon an abandoned cabin deep in the woods, only to find it occupied by something ancient and malevolent. As each story ended, a silence would fall over our little group, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the distant howl of what sounded like a coyote. Usually these sounds were comforting, a reminder that we were in the heart of nature. But tonight they felt ominous. The howl seemed closer, more insistent, and the rustling in the nearby bushes sounded less like the innocent movements of small animals and more like something else. I found myself constantly scanning the edges of the firelight, my heart pounding in my chest at every snap of a twig. The familiar woods, the place I had always considered a sanctuary, now felt alien and threatening. It was as if the very essence of Banff had shifted, the playful magic replaced by something darker, something ancient and unknown stirring beneath the surface of the familiar landscape. This year's trip felt different, all right. And I had a growing, unsettling feeling that we were about to find out just how different it was going to be. The next morning, the unsettling feeling hadn't dissipated. If anything, it had solidified into a knot of unease in my stomach. The sun rose over the mountain peaks, painting them in a glorious golden light, and the forest seemed to hum with the usual sounds of early morning birds chirping, squirrels chattering, the gentle rush of the river. But beneath it all, I could still sense that subtle wrongness, like a dissonant chord in an otherwise harmonious melody. We decided to hike to Lake Agnes, a popular spot known for its stunning views and the charming tea house nestled on its shore. Usually, this is a cheerful, bustling trail filled with hikers of all ages, their voices echoing through the trees. Today, however, the trail felt strangely deserted. We passed only a handful of other people, their greetings feeling perfunctory, their eyes somehow distant. It was as if everyone was caught in their own private bubble of quiet contemplation, or perhaps, like us, wrestling with an unspoken sense of foreboding. As we climbed higher, the trees grew denser, their shadows longer and darker. The air became cooler, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. The silence of the woods pressed in on us, broken only by the crunch of our boots on the trail and our own hushed conversations. Even Ethan, usually full of boundless energy, walked quietly beside me, his gaze fixed on the path ahead. "Did you hear anything last night?" he asked me after a long stretch of silence. I hesitated. "Just the coyote, I think." "Why?" he shrugged, his eyes flicking nervously towards the trees. "I don't know, it sounded like more than just a coyote. Like something big." I tried to reassure him. "Probably just an elk or a deer. This is their home, remember." But my own voice lacked conviction. I had heard it too, that deeper, guttural sound that had punctuated the coyote's howl. It hadn't sounded like any animal I knew. When we finally reached Lake Agnes, the usual postcard, perfect scene felt strangely muted. The turquoise water of the lake shimmered under the morning sun, reflecting the majestic peaks that surrounded it like sentinels. But the air was still and heavy, lacking its usual crispness. Even the tea house, usually buzzing with activity, seemed quieter than usual, its patrons speaking in hushed tones. We ordered tea and scones and sat on the wooden deck overlooking the lake. The view was breathtaking, the kind that usually fills me with a sense of awe and tranquility. But today I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I kept catching myself glancing at the surrounding forest, half expecting to see something emerge from the shadows. "This just feels off," Mom said quietly, echoing my thoughts. "I can't explain it, but there's a strange energy here today." Dad nodded, his brow furrowed. "I agree. I felt it last night too. That howl, it didn't sound right." We sat in silence for a few moments, each of us lost in our own thoughts. The beauty of the lake felt almost oppressive, its stillness amplifying the unease that had settled over us. It was like a picture, perfect facade hiding something dark and unsettling beneath the surface. After finishing our tea, we decided to take a walk around the lake. The trail led us through a dense patch of forest, the trees towering above us, their branches interwoven like skeletal fingers. The sunlight struggled to penetrate the canopy, casting the path in a perpetual twilight. The air grew colder, and a dampness clung to the moss-covered rocks and tree trunks. As we walked deeper into the woods, the sounds of the tea house faded behind us, replaced by an almost deafening silence. It was a silence that felt heavy, pregnant with something unspoken. I started to feel a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, the feeling of being watched intensifying. Suddenly, Ethan stopped dead in his tracks, his eyes wide with fear. "Did you see that?" he whispered, pointing towards the trees. I followed his gaze, but I didn't see anything at first. Then I noticed it, a fleeting movement in the shadows, a glimpse of something large and dark disappearing behind a thicket of trees. "What was it?" I asked, my heart pounding in my chest. "I don't know," Ethan said, his voice trembling. "It was big and it moved fast." Dad stepped forward, peering into the shadows. "Probably just a bear, they're common around here." But Ethan shook his head vehemently. "No, it wasn't a bear. It was different. It was too tall, and it moved weirdly." I felt a shiver run down my spine. Ethan wasn't usually one to exaggerate. If he said it was different, it probably was. We continued walking, our pace quickening, our eyes constantly scanning the surrounding woods. The feeling of being watched grew stronger, almost palpable. It was as if something was stalking us, keeping just out of sight, its unseen eyes fixed on our every move. As we rounded a bend in the trail, we came across something that made us stop in our tracks. Scratched into the bark of a large aspen tree was a series of strange symbols. They looked old, almost ancient, and they didn't resemble any kind of animal markings or typical graffiti. They were intricate, almost ritualistic, and they seemed to radiate a sense of malevolence. "What are those?" Ethan asked, his voice hushed with awe and a hint of fear. Dad examined them closely, running his fingers over the rough bark. "I've never seen anything like it," he said, his brow furrowed in thought. "Maybe some kind of old indigenous marking." Mom shook her head slowly. "I don't think so. They feel wrong. Dark." I couldn't agree more. There was something deeply unsettling about those symbols, something that resonated with the unease I had been feeling since we arrived. It was as if they were a sign, a warning of something ancient and malevolent lurking in these woods. We continued our walk around the lake, but the discovery of the symbols had cast a dark shadow over our mood. The beauty of the scenery seemed to mock our growing fear, the pristine wilderness now feeling like a potential hiding place for something sinister. As we made our way back down the trail towards our campsite, the feeling of being watched persisted. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see something or someone following us. The whispers of the wind through the trees seemed to carry a strange and unintelligible murmur, like the woods themselves were trying to tell us something, a secret warning we couldn't quite decipher. Back at the campsite, the familiar comfort of our little haven felt tainted. The fire pit seemed colder, the surrounding trees darker and more menacing. The unease that had started as a subtle feeling had now grown into a palpable sense of dread. Something was wrong in Banff this year, something fundamentally different. and I had a terrifying feeling that we were about to find out exactly what it was. The whispers in the woods were growing louder, and I feared they were calling our names. That night, sleep was a distant luxury. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig outside our tent sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. The darkness seemed thicker, more oppressive than any I had experienced in Banff before. It felt alive, teeming with unseen eyes and unheard whispers. Even the comforting presence of my family inside the tent couldn't fully quell the growing terror that had taken root in my heart. Sometime in the dead of night, I was jolted awake by a sound. It wasn't a loud noise, more of a subtle shift in the ambient sounds of the forest. The usual gentle murmur of the river seemed to have faded, replaced by an unnerving silence. And within that silence, I could hear it, a low, guttural growl, closer than the coyote we had heard the previous night. I held my breath, straining my ears, my heart hammering against my ribs. The growl came again, this time followed by the distinct sound of heavy footsteps moving through the underbrush. Whatever it was big, and it was getting closer. I nudged Ethan awake, my hand clamped over his mouth to stifle any sound. His eyes widened with fear as he listened to the approaching sounds. I could feel Mom and Dad stir beside us, their own senses alerted by the change in the night's rhythm. The footsteps stopped just outside our tent. We lay frozen, listening intently, the silence punctuated only by our ragged breaths. Then a low, raspy voice broke the stillness. It wasn't speaking words I could understand, more like a series of guttural clicks and moans, but there was an undeniable intelligence behind it, a chilling sentience that sent a wave of pure terror washing over me. The side of our tent bulged inward as something large pressed against it. We could hear heavy breathing, a thick, fetid odor seeping through the fabric. It smelled like wet earth and something else as something rotten. Suddenly, the creature let out a deafening roar, a sound that seemed to shake the very ground beneath us. It was a primal sound, filled with rage and hunger, and it echoed through the silent forest. We huddled together, paralyzed with fear, praying that whatever it was would just move on. But it didn't. We heard scraping sounds as something with sharp claws tore at the fabric of our tent. A long, gnarled finger, tipped with a black, wickedly sharp nail, poked through the tier. I stifled a scream, my eyes locked on the monstrous appendage. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the finger withdrew. The heavy breathing subsided, and after what felt like an eternity, we heard the footsteps retreating, moving back into the deeper parts of the woods. We lay there, trembling, not daring to move until the first hint of dawn began to paint the eastern sky. As soon as it was light enough to see, Dad cautiously unzipped the tent. What we saw outside sent a fresh wave of terror through us. Large, three-toed tracks were imprinted in the soft earth around our tent. They were unlike any animal tracks I had ever seen, far too big for a bear, and the distinct three-toed pattern was completely unfamiliar. The area where the creature had pressed against the tent was smeared with a dark, viscous fluid that smelled even more foul in the daylight, and then we saw it, another one of those strange symbols, scratched into the side of a nearby tree, this one larger and more intricate than the one we had seen at Lake Agnes. It was positioned so that it faced our campsite, as if marking us, claiming us. What was that thing? Ethan whispered, his voice hoarse with fear. Dad shook his head, his face pale. I don't know. But we need to get out of here. Now, we packed up our campsite with frantic speed, our movements fueled by adrenaline and terror. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every rustle of leaves made us jump. We didn't speak much, our shared fear creating a heavy silence between us. As we hurried back towards the main road, we passed another campsite that had been completely destroyed. Tents were ripped to shreds. Camping gear was scattered everywhere, and there was no sign of the people who had been staying there. A chilling realization washed over me. Whatever we had encountered last night hadn't just been curious, it had been hunting. We finally reached our car, our legs burning and our lungs aching. Dad fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking. As we pulled out of the campsite, I glanced back at the woods, a sense of dread clutching at my heart. The familiar beauty of Banff now seemed like a cruel illusion, a deceptive mask hiding something ancient and terrifying. Back home, safe within the familiar walls of our house, the events of the past few days felt almost surreal, like a nightmare we couldn't quite shake. We went to the authorities, told them what we had seen, what we had heard. They listened politely, but I could see the skepticism in their eyes. They suggested it might have been an unusually large bear, or perhaps even a disturbed individual in the woods. They took a report, but I knew they didn't believe us. I've done my own research since then, poring over old books and online forums dedicated to local legends and unexplained phenomena in the Canadian Rockies. And I think I've found something that matches what we encountered. There are old stories, whispered among some of the long-time residents of the area, tales of a creature known as the Stella Omex Wildman, or sometimes simply referred to as the Sasquatch, but described with more sinister details, glowing red eyes, sharp claws, and a haunting, guttural vocalization. The stories often warn of strange symbols found near its tracks, said to be territorial markings, or perhaps even something more ritualistic. We went to Banff looking for the familiar comfort of nature, for the peace and beauty that had always drawn us back. Instead, we found something ancient, something malevolent, something that lurks just beyond the veil of our understanding. I don't think I'll ever look at those mountains the same way again. The familiar has become sinister, and the legends might just be real. And I have a terrifying feeling that our encounter was not the end of the story, but just the beginning. The whispers in the woods, I still hear them sometimes, even now, and they sound hungry. My name is Mike, and I've always considered myself a pretty level-headed guy. Not easily spooked, you know. I've seen my fair share of scary movies, even dipped my toes into some of those online horror communities, the ones that trade those short, unsettling stories. Creepypasta, they call M. I've read enough to know how they usually go, the jump scares, the build-up, the monster reveal. But nothing I've ever read, nothing I've ever seen on a screen, could have prepared me for what happened on that kayaking trip. It was supposed to be a break, a real escape from the everyday grind. City life had been suffocating me for months. The constant noise, the deadlines at work, even the friendly but relentless chatter of my neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, who always seemed to catch me just as I was trying to sneak into my apartment. I needed silence. I needed nature. I needed to be alone with my thoughts, or better yet, no thoughts at all. Ontario seemed like the perfect place. Miles and miles of pristine lakes, surrounded by dense forests, the kind of untouched wilderness you see in those nature documentaries. I'd planned this trip for months, meticulously gathering gear, poring over maps, and even watching a bunch of YouTube videos on solo kayaking techniques. I wasn't a complete newbie. I'd done some kayaking before, mostly on smaller, more populated lakes. But this was different. This was venturing into the heart of the Ontario lakelands, where some of these lakes stretch for what felt like forever, with barely a sign of civilization. I opted for a less traveled route, a chain of interconnected lakes that promised solitude and breathtaking scenery. I'd packed enough food and supplies for 5 days, carefully rationing everything to keep my kayak as light as possible. The first day was exactly what I'd hoped for. The sun was shining, the water was crystal clear, and the air was crisp and clean. The rhythmic paddling was almost meditative, and the only sounds were the gentle lapping of the water against my kayak and the occasional call of a bird. I felt a sense of peace I hadn't experienced in years. I made good progress, covering a decent distance by late afternoon. I found a small, secluded island with a sandy beach to set up camp for the night. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, I felt a profound sense of contentment. I cooked a simple meal over a small portable stove, the aroma mingling with the scent of pine from the surrounding trees. Later, as darkness enveloped the island, I sat by a small fire, watching the stars appear like diamonds scattered across a black velvet cloth. The silence was immense, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the distant hoot of an owl. It was perfect. The second day started much the same. The lake was calm, almost mirror-like, reflecting the clear blue sky and the surrounding trees with stunning clarity. I paddled for hours, feeling a comfortable rhythm, my mind drifting in and out of thoughts. I saw a couple of loons diving for fish, and even spotted a deer drinking water at the edge of the forest. It was exactly the kind of wildlife encounter I'd been hoping for. Around midday, the weather started to change. The sky, which had been so clear, began to fill with dark, ominous clouds. The wind picked up, and the once calm lake started to churn, the gentle lapping turning into more aggressive waves that rocked my kayak. I knew I needed to find shelter, and fast. I scanned the shoreline, hoping to spot another island or a protected cove. After what felt like an eternity, I spotted a small inlet, a narrow channel leading into what looked like a smaller, more secluded lake. The entrance was partially hidden by thick reeds and overhanging trees, but it seemed like my best bet for finding some respite from the worsening weather. I paddled hard against the wind and waves, finally reaching the relative calm of the channel. As I made my way through the narrow passage, the atmosphere changed dramatically. The sunlight was almost completely blocked by the dense foliage, and the air felt heavy and damp. The sounds of the wind and waves were muffled, replaced by an eerie silence. The water in the channel was dark and still, and I couldn't see more than a few inches below the surface. It felt different. Not necessarily threatening, but definitely unsettling. The channel opened into a small, circular lake. The shoreline was completely surrounded by thick, dark forest, the trees seeming to lean over the water like silent watchers. There was a heavy mist hanging over the lake, further adding to the sense of isolation. It was undeniably beautiful in a wild, untamed way, but it also felt lonely, intensely lonely. I paddled towards the far side of the lake, hoping to find a suitable spot to wait out the storm. As I got closer to the shore, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Partially submerged in the murky water, near a cluster of fallen logs, was what looked like the wreckage of another kayak. It was old and battered, covered in moss and algae, suggesting it had been there for a long time. A shiver ran down my spine. Who had been in that kayak? What had happened to them? I pulled my own kayak onto the shore, my hands trembling slightly. The forest here was even denser, the trees tall and imposing, their branches intertwined like skeletal fingers reaching towards the sky. The silence was almost deafening, amplifying the pounding of my own heart. I decided to set up a makeshift camp, just in case the storm lasted longer than expected. I found a relatively clear spot beneath a thick canopy of trees and quickly started to unpack my gear. As I was setting up my tent, I couldn't shake the image of the wrecked kayak from my mind. It felt like a bad omen, a warning of some kind. I tried to tell myself it was probably just an old, abandoned kayak that accidents happen. But the feeling of unease lingered, a knot of anxiety tightening in my stomach. The storm finally broke a few hours later. The sky opened up, and rain poured down in sheets, accompanied by loud claps of thunder that echoed across the lake. I huddled inside my tent, feeling strangely vulnerable in the midst of this wild, untamed place. The wind howled through the trees, and the sound of the rain drumming on the tent fabric was relentless. As the storm raged outside, my thoughts kept returning to the wrecked kayak. Who was the person who used to paddle it? Were they okay? Had they simply lost their kayak, or had something more sinister happened? The more I thought about it, the more the unsettling feeling grew. It was the isolation I told myself. Being alone in the middle of nowhere, with no one else around. It made your imagination run wild, but even as I tried to rationalize my fear, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something else at play here. Something about this lake, about the way the light didn't seem to penetrate the surface of the water, about the oppressive silence of the surrounding forest, it all felt wrong. The storm eventually subsided as night fell, leaving behind an eerie stillness. The rain had stopped, but the sky remained overcast, casting long, distorted shadows across the landscape. I cautiously stepped out of my tent, the air thick with the smell of wet earth and pine. The lake was calm again, the surface like a dark, glassy mirror. And that's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, a reflection of the moon hidden behind the clouds. But as I looked closer, my heart pounded in my chest. There, in the middle of the lake, was something moving beneath the surface. It was large, and it was dark, and it was definitely not a fish. It moved slowly, deliberately, its shape indistinct in the murky water. But as it got closer, I could make out more details. It was long and sinuous like a giant snake, but thicker, much thicker, and it seemed to have limbs. Or maybe fins, I couldn't be sure. My breath caught in my throat. I stood frozen, unable to look away, my mind racing. What was it? I'd read stories about lake monsters, of course. Legends whispered around campfires. But I'd always dismissed them as just that, stories. This was real. I could see it moving, just below the surface, getting closer and closer to the shore. Panic started to set in. I knew I had to do something, but I was paralyzed by fear. Should I get back in my kayak? Should I try to run into the forest? Neither option seemed particularly appealing. My kayak was small and flimsy, no match for whatever that thing was. And the forest, who knew what else lurked in those dark woods? As the creature got closer, I could see its shape more clearly. It was long and serpentine with a series of humps along its back. Its skin looked dark and leathery, and I could just make out what looked like a long, slender neck and a small, almost reptilian head. It moved with an unnerving grace, gliding effortlessly through the water. It was now just a few feet from the shore, right in front of where my kayak was pulled up. I held my breath, my eyes fixed on the dark shape beneath the surface. It paused for a moment, as if sensing my presence. And then, slowly, deliberately, it began to rise. The water rippled and bulged as the creature continued its ascent. It broke the surface slowly, revealing itself in the dim twilight. It was far larger than I had initially thought, easily the length of my kayak, maybe even longer. Its dark, leathery skin glistened with water, and the humps along its back looked like jagged peaks of some submerged mountain range. The head that emerged was unlike anything I had ever seen before. It was relatively small compared to the size of its body, with a long, slender snout filled with rows of sharp, needle-like teeth. Its eyes were dark and unsettlingly intelligent, fixated on me with a cold, predatory gaze. There was no warmth in them, no hint of anything familiar or comforting, just pure primal hunger. A low, guttural growl emanated from its throat, a sound that vibrated through the air and seemed to sink deep into my bones. It was a sound that spoke of ancient depths and forgotten terrors. My mind struggled to comprehend what I was seeing. This couldn't be real. This had to be some kind of nightmare, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and isolation. But the fear that gripped me was undeniably real, a cold, paralyzing dread that told me this was no dream. The creature continued to rise, its massive body slowly emerging from the depths of the lake. I could now see two pairs of what looked like short, webbed limbs or fins, positioned along its sides. They didn't seem particularly strong or agile on land, but they clearly propelled it through the water with ease. It was close enough now that I could smell it. It was a musky, earthy odor like decaying leaves and stagnant water, with a hint of something else, something acrid and vaguely metallic that made my stomach churn. I finally managed to break free from my frozen state. My instincts screamed at me to run, to get as far away from this thing as possible. But my legs felt like lead, and my mind was still reeling from the shock of what I was witnessing. The creature seemed to sense my fear. It let out another low growl and began to move towards my kayak, its eyes never leaving mine. It moved with a surprising speed for its size, its powerful body undulating through the shallow water. I knew I had to act fast. My gaze fell on the small camping knife I had left on the ground near my backpack. It was a flimsy thing, more suited for opening packages than fighting off a monster, but it was the only weapon I had. I scrambled towards it, my eyes still fixed on the creature as it lumbered closer. Just as my fingers closed around the handle of the knife, the creature reached my kayak. It nudged it with its snout, and the small vessel rocked precariously on the shore. I could hear the scraping of its leathery skin against the plastic hull. Fear gave way to a surge of adrenaline. This was my only way out. If it destroyed my kayak, I would be stranded here, completely at its mercy. I lunged forward, the small knife clutched tightly in my hand, and thrust it towards the creature's head. It was a desperate, futile gesture, I knew, but it was all I could think to do. The knife barely scratched its thick hide, but it seemed to startle the creature. It recoiled slightly, its dark eyes widening for a fraction of a second. That was all the opening I needed. I scrambled towards my kayak, my heart pounding in my chest. I pushed it into the water, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the paddle. I jumped in, shoving off from the shore with my feet. The creature roared in frustration, a deafening sound that echoed across the lake. It lunged towards me, its massive jaws snapping. I paddled frantically, pushing myself away from the shore with all my might. The kayak shot forward, slicing through the water. I glanced back, and my blood ran cold. The creature was following me, its powerful body propelling it through the water with alarming speed. It was faster than I could have possibly imagined. I paddled harder, my muscles screaming in protest. The small lake wasn't very large, but it felt like an ocean as I desperately tried to put distance between myself and the monster. I could hear its heavy breathing behind me, the sound getting closer and closer. I risked another glance back. The creature was right behind me, its head just a few feet away. I could see the glint of its sharp teeth, the cold, reptilian eyes filled with hunger. I knew it was only a matter of time before it reached me. Suddenly, the creature let out a piercing shriek, a sound that was even more terrifying than its growl. It thrashed violently in the water, its massive body twisting and turning. For a moment, I thought I had somehow managed to injure it, but then I saw it. Something else was moving in the water beneath the creature. It was another dark shape, even larger than the first one. It was swirling around the creature, its form mostly hidden beneath the surface, but I could see glimpses of something long and serpentine, with multiple sets of fins or appendages. The two creatures seemed to be fighting a silent, terrifying battle unfolding in the dark water. The first creature roared and snapped, trying to bite at its unseen attacker. The water churned and frothed as they wrestled beneath the surface. I seized the opportunity and paddled with renewed vigor towards the narrow channel that led back to the larger lake. I didn't dare to look back, my only focus on getting away from that cursed place as fast as I could. As I reached the entrance to the channel, I could still hear the sounds of the struggle behind me, the splashing and thrashing growing fainter as I moved further away. I didn't know what was happening back there, but I wasn't about to stick around and find out. The channel seemed even darker and more ominous than before. The silence was heavy, broken only by the frantic rhythm of my paddling and my own ragged breathing. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every rustle of leaves sounded like the approach of some unseen horror. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I emerged back into the larger lake. The storm clouds had mostly dissipated, and the moon was now peeking through the breaks, casting an eerie glow on the water. The waves were still choppy, but nothing like they had been before. I didn't stop paddling. I kept going, putting as much distance as possible between myself and that accursed small lake. I paddled for hours, driven by a primal fear that wouldn't let me rest. The exhaustion was immense, my muscles ached, and my hands were raw and blistered, but I didn't dare to slow down. As the first light of dawn began to appear on the horizon, I finally allowed myself to rest. I pulled my kayak onto the shore of a small, unnamed island, far from the secluded inlet. I collapsed onto the sand, my body trembling with exhaustion and lingering fear. I spent the rest of the day on that island, trying to recover from the ordeal. I ate some of my remaining food, but I had no appetite. My mind kept replaying the terrifying encounter in the small lake. What had I seen? What were those creatures? I knew I couldn't stay there. As soon as I felt strong enough, I would have to get back on the water and try to find my way back to civilization. But the thought of paddling through those vast, dark lakes now filled me with a terror I had never known before. What other horrors lurked beneath the surface? What other ancient creatures called these waters home? As night fell again, the sounds of the forest seemed amplified, every rustle and chirp sending shivers down my spine. I huddled in my tent, the small camping knife clutched in my hand, my eyes wide with fear. I knew I would never look at a lake the same way again. The peaceful solitude I had sought had been shattered, replaced by a terrifying awareness of the unknown depths and the things that might lurk within them. I was no longer just Mike, the guy looking for a peaceful kayaking trip. I was Mike, the guy who had seen something that should not exist, and who knew that the wilderness held secrets far more terrifying than anything he could have ever imagined. And somewhere out there, in the dark waters of Ontario, something was waiting. The next few days were a blur of fear and exhaustion. Every paddle stroke was a reminder of the creature lurking beneath the surface. Every ripple on the water sent a jolt of panic through me. I avoided the smaller, more secluded lakes, sticking to the larger, more open bodies of water where I felt I had a better chance of spotting any approaching danger. Sleep was a luxury I could barely afford. Every shadow, every sound of the forest, conjured images of dark shapes rising from the depths. I would drift off for brief periods, only to be jolted awake by nightmares of sharp teeth and cold, unblinking eyes. My food supply was dwindling, and I was constantly on edge, my senses heightened, scanning the water and the shoreline for any sign of the monstrous creature. On the third day after the encounter, I finally saw a sign of civilization. A distant drone of a motorboat, faint at first, but growing steadily louder. Hope surged through me, a powerful wave that momentarily pushed back the fear. I paddled towards the sound with renewed energy, my heart pounding with anticipation. It took what felt like hours, but eventually, I saw it, a small fishing boat with two figures on board. I yelled and waved my arms frantically, my voice hoarse and cracking. They spotted me and turned their boat in my direction. As they got closer, I could see the concerned looks on their faces. I was a disheveled mess, my clothes torn and dirty, my eyes wide and bloodshot. I'm sure I looked like I'd seen a ghost. They helped me in my kayak onto their boat, offering me water and a blanket. They asked me what had happened, and at first I hesitated. How could I explain what I had seen? They would think I was crazy, but the need to tell anyone, was overwhelming. I recounted my story, stumbling over my words, trying to convey the sheer terror of the encounter. I told them about the wrecked kayak, the feeling of unease in the secluded lake, and the horrifying creature that had risen from the depths. The two fishermen exchanged skeptical glances. They were polite, but I could see the disbelief in their eyes. They told me stories of large sturgeon and muskellunge in these lakes, fish that could grow to impressive sizes. They suggested that perhaps I had seen one of those, my imagination getting the better of me due to the isolation and the storm. I knew what I had seen. It wasn't a fish. It was something ancient, something monstrous, but I couldn't convince them. They chalked it up to stress and exhaustion, offering me a ride back to the nearest town. Back in the town, I went straight to the local police station. I tried to report what I had seen, hoping that maybe, just maybe, someone would take me seriously. But the reaction was the same. More skeptical looks, more polite suggestions that I had been mistaken. They filed a report about the abandoned kayak I had seen, promising to look into it, but I could tell they didn't believe my story about the creature. Dejected and still shaken, I booked the first bus back to the city. I couldn't wait to get away from those lakes, away from the oppressive silence and the constant fear. Life back in the city felt strangely surreal. The noise in the crowds, which had once felt suffocating, now felt comforting, a reminder of the safety and normalcy of everyday life. I tried to put the kayaking trip behind me, to forget what I had seen. I threw away the small camping knife, a reminder of my helplessness in the face of the unknown. But the memory of the creature wouldn't fade. It haunted my dreams, its cold, intelligent eyes staring into my soul. I found myself constantly looking at bodies of water with a newfound sense of dread. Swimming pools, even large puddles, seemed to hold a potential for something dark and sinister to emerge. I started researching local folklore and legends of the Ontario lakelands. I spent hours online, searching for any mention of strange creatures or unexplained disappearances. I found a few old tales, whispered stories passed down through generations, about something ancient and malevolent lurking in the deeper lakes. Stories of strange sightings by local fishermen, of boats mysteriously capsizing in calm waters. Stories that I had dismissed as mere superstition before, but now seemed terrifyingly plausible. I even tried to find information about the wrecked kayak I had seen. I contacted local authorities and posted in online forums, hoping someone might recognize it or know something about it. But I found nothing. It was as if the kayak, and perhaps the person who used to paddle it, had simply vanished without a trace. The experience changed me. I became more withdrawn, more wary of the world around me. The sense of peace and tranquility I once found in nature was gone, replaced by a constant undercurrent of anxiety. I still went hiking occasionally, but I always stayed on well-trodden paths, far away from any large bodies of water. I never went kayaking again. The thought of being alone on a lake, surrounded by deep, dark water, filled me with a terror that I couldn't overcome. The solitude I had once craved now felt like a dangerous invitation to unseen horrors. Sometimes late at night, when the city noise fades into a low hum, I still think about that small, secluded lake. I wonder what happened to the other creature, the one that attacked the first. Was it another of its kind, or something else entirely? And I often wonder if the creature I saw is still out there, lurking beneath the surface, waiting for its next unsuspecting victim. I know I'll never forget its cold, predatory eyes, the ancient terror they held. And I know that somewhere in the vast, interconnected lakes of Ontario, something is still waiting in the deep. And it's more real than any nightmare I could have ever imagined. I'm Mike, and I went on a solo kayaking trip, hoping for peace. I found something far more terrifying, something that I will carry with me for the rest of my life. And every time I see a calm, still body of water, I can't help but wonder what lies beneath. Hey, it's Ashley. Right now, I'm huddled in what I pray is some kind of temporary shelter, the wind howling like a banshee outside, and honestly, just thinking about how badly this whole fun winter adventure went wrong. It all seemed so idyllic just yesterday. Quebec in the winter, picture perfect, right? Snow-covered landscapes, crisp air, the kind of scenery that makes you want to plaster it all over your Instagram. And yet, for the first few hours of our snowshoeing trip, it was exactly that. There were 4 of us, me, Liam, Sarah, and Ben. We've been friends since college, That inseparable kind of group that plans trips together whenever we can steal a few days away from the grind of real life. Liam is the planner, always meticulously researching locations and activities. Sarah is the free spirit, the one who pushes us to try new things. Ben is the comic relief, cracking jokes even in the most awkward situations. And me, I guess I'm usually the cautious one, the voice of reason who sometimes gets overruled by the other's enthusiasm. This time, the enthusiasm was for snowshoeing in the Laurentian Mountains, about a 2-hour drive north of Montreal. Liam had found this trail online, boasting stunning views and a moderate difficulty level, perfect for a day trip. We packed warm layers, plenty of snacks, water, and of course, snowshoes. The morning started bright and sunny, the snow sparkling under a clear blue sky. The air was so fresh it felt like it was scrubbing the city smog right out of our lungs. The trail began easily enough, winding through a picturesque forest of snow-laden pine trees. The only sounds were the crunch of our snowshoes in the crisp snow and our cheerful chatter. We took photos, laughed, and just generally enjoyed being out in nature, away from deadlines and responsibilities. Liam, ever the responsible one, kept checking his GPS, making sure we were staying on the marked path. Sarah was the first to spot a family of deer grazing peacefully in a clearing. Even Ben, despite complaining about the extra weight of his emergency supply of snacks, mostly candy bars, seemed genuinely happy. After a couple of hours, we reached a viewpoint that Liam had highlighted on the map. It was breathtaking. A vast panorama of rolling hills and snow-covered valleys stretched out before us, the silence broken only by the occasional gust of wind. We took a break, ate our sandwiches, and basked in the winter wonderland. It felt like one of those perfect moments you wish you could freeze in time. That's probably when things started to subtly go wrong, though we didn't realize it then. As we started heading back, following our own tracks in the snow, the weather began to change. The clear blue sky gradually turned a hazy gray, and the wind picked up, swirling snowflakes around us. It wasn't a blizzard, not yet, but the visibility started to decrease. Liam consulted his GPS again, and that's when the first hint of trouble appeared. He said, furrowing his brow, "According to this, we should have reached that fork in the trail by now." We looked around. Everything looked the same, endless rows of snow-covered trees. It was easy to get disoriented. Maybe we missed the marker, Sarah suggested, peering through the falling snow. We backtracked a bit, carefully scanning the sides of the trail for any sign of the familiar blue marker that indicated our route. But there was nothing. The wind grew stronger, whipping snow into our faces, making it harder to see. The temperature seemed to drop suddenly, and a sense of unease began to settle over us. Ben, who had been relatively quiet since the weather changed, tried to lighten the mood with a joke about being attacked by snow monsters, but it fell a little flat. We decided to keep moving in the direction we thought was right, hoping to stumble upon the trail markers soon, but the landscape remained stubbornly the same. Every tree looked identical, every snowdrift indistinguishable from the next. Our earlier tracks were quickly being covered by the fresh snowfall, making it impossible to rely on them. Liam's face was starting to show real concern. He checked his GPS repeatedly, but the signal was becoming weaker and more erratic. "I think we might be off the trail," he admitted finally, his voice barely audible above the wind. A knot of fear tightened in my stomach. Getting lost was always a possibility you acknowledged in the back of your mind before a hike, but you never really think it will happen to you, especially not on a moderate trail that was supposed to be well marked. We huddled together, trying to decide what to do. The daylight was starting to fade, and the thought of spending the night out here, in the freezing cold, with the snow coming down harder now, was terrifying. Sarah, ever the optimist, tried to keep our spirits up, reminding us that we had layers of clothing, food, and water. But even her voice held a tremor of worry. Ben, surprisingly, was the most practical in that moment. "Okay," he said, his usual jovial tone replaced with a serious one. "Panic isn't going to help. Liam, can you still get a signal?" Liam shook his head. "It's patchy. I can't get a lock on our exact location." We decided to keep moving, hoping to find some landmark, anything that looked familiar. We trudged through the deepening snow, our snowshoes feeling heavier with every step. The wind howled relentlessly, and the snow stung our faces. It felt like we were walking in circles, the same trees appearing again and again in the swirling whiteout. As dusk began to settle, casting long, eerie shadows across the snow, our hope dwindled. We were lost, and the weather was only getting worse. The fun winter adventure had turned into something else entirely, something cold and menacing. And then, just when we thought things couldn't get any worse, we saw it. At first, it was just a fleeting glimpse through the falling snow, a dark shape in the distance. We stopped squinting, trying to make it out. It looked wrong, out of place. It was too tall, too thin, and the way it seemed to move, it wasn't like an animal. Liam fumbled for his phone, trying to get a picture, but his hands were shaking too much. "What is that?" Sarah whispered, her voice filled with a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. Ben just stared, his usual lightheartedness completely gone. As the figure moved closer, its shape became clearer. It was humanoid, but impossibly gaunt and elongated. Its limbs seemed too long, its movements jerky and unnatural, and then we saw its face, or what we assumed was its face. Two large, dark holes where its eyes should have been, and a wide, thin gash that looked like a grotesque smile. It wasn't wearing any clothes, and yet it didn't seem to be affected by the biting cold. Its skin was pale and almost translucent, and we could see the faint outline of what looked like branches or antlers protruding from its back. A primal fear gripped us, a fear unlike anything I had ever felt before. This wasn't a bear or a moose or any animal we knew. This was something else, something ancient and malevolent that had no place in this world. Without a word, we turned and ran, our snowshoes slapping against the snow as we scrambled through the trees. The wind seemed to carry a low, guttural sound behind us, a sound that sent shivers down our spines. We didn't dare look back. Our only thought was to get away, to escape whatever that thing was. We ran until our lungs burned and our legs ached, until we couldn't run anymore. We collapsed in the snow, gasping for breath, not knowing if we had outrun it or not. The darkness was closing in, and the snow continued to fall, blanketing the landscape in a thick layer of white. We were lost, alone, and something was out there in the woods with us. And I have a terrible feeling that it's not going to leave us alone. We lay there for what felt like an eternity, the only sounds our ragged breathing and the relentless howl of the wind. The snow continued to fall, a soft but persistent blanket that threatened to bury us. The darkness was now complete, the last vestiges of daylight swallowed by the storm. We huddled together for warmth, our initial adrenaline replaced by a bone, deep chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. Did anyone get a good look at that thing? Sarah finally whispered, her voice trembling slightly. Liam shook his head. It was too fast. In the snow, I just saw the shape, the height, and that face. He shuddered. Ben, usually the most vocal of our group, remained silent, staring into the swirling darkness as if he could still see the creature lurking among the trees. For my part, I couldn't shake the image of those empty eye sockets and that horrific grin. It was the stuff of nightmares, something that should not exist. My mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation. Could it have been a trick of the light? Some kind of large animal we didn't recognize? But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. There was an unnatural quality to its appearance and movements that defied any rational explanation. "We need to move," I said, my voice sounding surprisingly steady despite the fear churning inside me. "Staying here isn't safe. We don't know if it's still out there." Liam nodded in agreement. "You're right. We need to find shelter, somewhere we can wait out the storm. But the prospect of finding shelter in this vast, snow-covered wilderness in the dead of night felt almost impossible. We managed to get back on our feet, our bodies stiff and aching. The snow was deeper now, making each step a struggle. We tried to keep moving in the same direction we had been heading before we saw the creature, hoping that it was the way back to the trail. But without any landmarks, we were essentially walking blind through a white void. The wind continued to buffet us, and the temperature seemed to be dropping further. Our fingers and toes were starting to feel numb despite our gloves and thick socks. Hypothermia was a real threat, and the thought of succumbing to the cold added another layer of fear to our already desperate situation. We stumbled upon a small cluster of evergreen trees that offered a slight reprieve from the wind. We huddled beneath their branches, trying to conserve what little body heat we had left. We shared the last of our snacks, a couple of granola bars and some trail mix, and sipped sparingly from our water bottles. Every rustle of the wind, every snap of a twig, sent a jolt of fear through us. We were constantly looking over our shoulders, expecting to see that gaunt figure emerge from the darkness. Hours crawled by. The storm showed no signs of letting up. The darkness was absolute. broken only by the faint glow of our phone screens, which were quickly losing battery. Liam had tried to call for help several times, but there was no signal. We were completely cut off from the outside world. As the night wore on, the cold became almost unbearable. We shivered uncontrollably, our teeth chattering. My mind started to play tricks on me, the shadows seeming to take on menacing shapes. I kept seeing fleeting movements out of the corner of my eye, convinced that the creature was circling us, watching us. It was Sarah who first noticed it, a faint sound carried on the wind. It was a low, rhythmic scratching sound, like fingernails dragging across rough bark. It seemed to be coming from somewhere nearby. We froze, straining our ears to hear over the wind. Scratching sound came again, closer this time. It was definitely moving. Liam cautiously turned on his phone's flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. We held our breath, our hearts pounding in our chests. The light illuminated the snow, covered ground around us. The dense trees beyond, nothing. Then the scratching sound came again, this time from directly above us. We tilted our heads back, our eyes scanning the branches of the trees above. And that's when we saw it. Perched in the branches of one of the evergreens, silhouetted against the slightly lighter sky, was the creature. It was crouched low, its long, spindly limbs wrapped around the branches. Its head was tilted to the side, as if it was listening intently. And then we saw its eyes. They weren't empty holes as we had thought before. In the darkness, they glowed with a faint, eerie luminescence, like two embers burning in the night. They were fixed on us, and in their cold, unblinking stare, I felt a profound sense of dread. It was hunting us. A strangled cry escaped Sarah's lips. Ben stumbled backward, his face pale in the dim light. Even Liam, usually so stoic, looked terrified. The creature remained motionless for a moment, its glowing eyes watching us. Then, slowly, deliberately, it began to move. It descended from the tree with an unsettling fluidity, its long limbs extending and retracting with an unnatural grace. We didn't wait. We knew we had to get away. We stumbled out from under the trees and plunged back into the darkness, the snowdrift slowing our progress. We could hear the creature behind us, the soft crunch of its steps in the snow somehow more terrifying than any roar. We ran blindly, our only goal to put as much distance as possible between us and that thing. We tripped and fell, scrambling back to our feet, our bodies screaming in protest. The wind seemed to mock us, and the snow continued to fall, erasing any trace of our path. At some point, I lost sight of the others. The darkness and the swirling snow had swallowed them.
Liam! Sarah! Ben!
I shouted, my voice swallowed by the storm. Only the wind answered. Panic threatened to overwhelm me. I was alone, lost in the middle of nowhere, being hunted by something I couldn't comprehend. I stumbled on, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my hope dwindling with every step. Then I saw it, a faint light in the distance, flickering through the trees. It was too faint to be the sun, but it was definitely a light. A desperate surge of hope coursed through me. It had to be some kind of building, maybe a cabin or a ranger station. Ignoring the burning in my lungs and the ache in my legs, I stumbled towards the light, pushing my way through the dense trees and deep snow. The light grew slowly brighter as I got closer. Finally, I reached it. It was a small, dilapidated shack, barely visible through the heavy snowfall. A single, flickering light shone from a window. It looked deserted, like it hadn't been used in years. But right now, it was the only sign of civilization I had seen in hours, and I wasn't going to pass it up. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding with a mixture of hope and trepidation. What if the creature was inside? What if this was some kind of trap? But the need for shelter, for warmth, outweighed my fear. I reached the door, an old weathered wooden slab that hung slightly ajar. Hesitantly, I pushed it open and stepped inside. The air inside was cold and musty, but it was a welcome relief from the biting wind and snow. The shack consisted of a single room, small and bare. A rough wooden table stood in the center, and a couple of rickety chairs were pushed against the walls. In one corner, a small wood burning stove stood cold and empty. The only light came from an old kerosene lamp sitting on the table, its flame flickering weakly. The shack was empty. There was no sign of anyone or anything. Just the bare walls and the lingering smell of damp wood and decay. Relief washed over me, followed immediately by a fresh wave of fear. Where were Liam, Sarah, and Ben? Were they still out there in the storm? Or had that thing found them? I huddled beside the stove, trying to conserve what little heat I had. I wrapped my arms around myself, shivering uncontrollably. I needed to find a way to contact help, but my phone was dead. I needed to find my friends, but I had no idea where to even start looking. And then I heard it, the faint scratching sound coming from outside the shack. It was closer now, more insistent. My blood ran cold. It had followed me. I stood up, my legs shaking, and slowly backed away from the door. My eyes darted around the small room, searching for anything I could use as a weapon. A heavy, rusty poker lay beside the stove. I grabbed it, my knuckles white as I gripped it tightly. The scratching sound stopped just outside the door. A moment of silence hung in the air, thick with tension. Then, the door creaked open slowly, and the gaunt figure stepped into the shack, its glowing eyes fixed on me, and that horrific grin stretched across its pale face. I was trapped, and I had a feeling my fun winter adventure was about to take a very dark turn. The sight of the creature in the doorway sent a jolt of pure terror through me. My grip tightened on the rusty poker, my knuckles white. It stood there for a moment, its glowing eyes fixed on mine, that grotesque smile unmoving. The flickering lamplight cast long, distorted shadows on the walls, making the scene even more surreal and terrifying. I knew, with a sickening certainty, that this was no ordinary animal, no figment of my imagination. This was something ancient and evil, drawn to our presence in its domain. And now it had found me. It took a slow, deliberate step into the shack, its long, spindly limbs moving with that unsettling fluidity I had witnessed before. The silence in the small room was broken only by the soft crunch of its feet on the dusty wooden floor and my own ragged breathing. I raised the poker, my hand trembling, pointing the rusty tip towards the creature. "Stay back," I managed to croak out, my voice barely a whisper. The creature didn't react, didn't even seem to notice the makeshift weapon. It continued to advance, its glowing eyes never leaving mine. I could feel the cold radiating off of it, a chilling presence that seemed to seep into the very air around it. As it drew closer, I could see more details of its disturbing form. Its skin was even paler than I had initially thought, almost translucent, and I could now clearly see the network of dark, vein, like lines running beneath the surface. The branches or antlers protruding from its back were sharp and jagged, like twisted bones, and its hands, its fingers were impossibly long and thin, ending in sharp, pointed nails that looked like they could tear through flesh with ease. Fear lent me a desperate courage. When the creature was just a few feet away, I lunged forward, swinging the poker with all my might. The rusty metal connected with its torso with a dull thud. The creature stumbled back slightly, but it didn't cry out or even seem to register any pain. It just looked down at where I had struck it, its head tilted in that unsettlingly curious way. Then it looked back at me, its glowing eyes now filled with a cold, predatory intent. I knew then that the poker was useless against this thing. It was like hitting a ghost. I had to get out of the shack, back into the storm, even though the thought terrified me. At least in the woods, I would have a chance to run, to hide. I turned and scrambled towards the open doorway, but the creature was faster. It moved with a speed that belied its gaunt frame, its long limbs reaching out and grabbing my arm in a vise like grip. Its touch was icy cold, like holding onto a block of frozen stone. A wave of nausea washed over me. I tried to pull away, but its grip was too strong. Its long, sharp nails dug into my skin, drawing blood. I cried out in pain and terror, dropping the poker. My other hand flailed, desperately trying to break free from its grasp. But it was no use. The creature was incredibly strong. It pulled me towards it, its face coming closer. I could smell its breath, a cold, musty odor like that of decaying leaves and frozen earth. Its wide, thin smile seemed to widen further, revealing rows of small, needle-like teeth. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing for the worst. I expected pain tearing the end, but it didn't come. Instead, I felt a strange sensation, a chilling emptiness, as if something was being drained from me. I slowly opened my eyes. The creature was still holding my arm, its glowing eyes fixed on mine. But its expression had changed. The predatory intent was gone, replaced by something vacant. It released my arm, and I stumbled back, clutching my bleeding skin. I looked at the creature, confused and terrified. It just stood there, swaying slightly, its head lolling to the side. Then it turned and slowly walked towards the table where the kerosene lamp was flickering. It reached out one of its long, bony fingers and touched the flame. The finger didn't burn. Instead, the flame seemed to flicker and dim, as if being absorbed by the creature. It touched the flame again and again until the small fire was completely extinguished, plunging the shack into darkness. I stood there, frozen in fear, unable to see the creature but knowing it was still there, somewhere in the darkness with me. The only sound was the wind howling outside. Then I heard it move. A soft, shuffling sound moving away from me towards the back of the shack. I strained my ears trying to discern its movements. It sounded like it was scratching at the wall. I held my breath, listening intently. The scratching continued for a few moments, then stopped. Silence. After what felt like an eternity, I slowly reached for my phone. It was still dead. I desperately needed to find a way out of this shack, to get away from whatever that thing was. My hands fumbled in my pocket for my lighter. I flicked it on, the small flame providing a meager circle of light in the darkness. It wasn't much, but it was enough to see. The creature was gone. The back wall of the shack, which had been solid wood just moments ago, now had a large, jagged hole in it, as if something had torn its way through. I didn't hesitate. I knew I had to get out of there. I stumbled towards the hole in the wall and squeezed through, emerging back into the raging storm. The snow was still falling heavily, and the wind howled like a chorus of angry spirits. I had no idea where to go, but I knew I couldn't stay near that shack. I turned and ran, pushing my way through the deep snow, the small flame of my lighter my only guide. I ran until my legs felt like lead and my lungs were burning. I didn't dare stop, didn't dare look back. I eventually collapsed in the snow, exhausted and freezing. The lighter had gone out, and I was plunged back into darkness. I had no idea if I had escaped the creature, or if it was still out there hunting me. I huddled in the snow, trying to stay warm, my hope dwindling with every passing moment. I thought of Liam, Sarah, and Ben. Were they still alive? Had that thing gotten to them too? As the first hint of dawn began to break through the clouds, casting a faint, eerie light across the snow-covered landscape, I heard a sound in the distance. It was faint, but unmistakable. A sound I had been longing to hear all night. The sound of a snowmobile. With a surge of adrenaline, I pushed myself to my feet and stumbled towards the sound, shouting for help. The sound grew louder, and soon, a snowmobile emerged from the swirling snow, 2 figures bundled in warm clothes sitting on it. They spotted me and quickly drove over. Relief washed over me as they helped me onto the snowmobile. I was safe, at least for now. They told me that a search party had been dispatched when we hadn't returned by nightfall. They had been searching for hours in the blizzard conditions. They asked me about my friends, and I told them everything that had happened. We searched for Liam, Sarah, and Ben for hours, the snowmobile cutting through the deep snow. But we found no trace of them. The only things we found were our discarded snowshoes. The authorities launched a full-scale search in the following days, but no sign of my friends was ever found. The shack was also discovered, but it was empty, with no signs of forced entry other than the hole in the back wall. The kerosene lamp was there, extinguished. The official report stated that my friends had likely succumbed to the elements. They couldn't explain the hole in the shack or my story about the creature. They probably thought I was delirious from the cold and exhaustion. But I know what I saw. I know what happened in those woods. And I know that something unnatural lurks in the snowy wilderness of Quebec, something that is not meant to be there. I never went back to Quebec. I never went snowshoeing again. The memory of those glowing eyes and that horrific smile will forever be etched into my mind. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind howls outside my window, I still hear that faint scratching sound. And I can't help but wonder if it's out there, somewhere in the darkness, still hunting. And I pray it never finds me again. Call me Chris. It's a pretty straightforward name, and honestly, so is my life most of the time. I work as a park ranger up here in Jasper National Park. Beautiful place, truly. Majestic mountains that punch holes in the sky. Forests so dense you could get lost in them for days and never see the same tree twice, and lakes that reflect the peaks like giant, still mirrors. I've been doing this job for 7 years now, ever since I graduated college with a degree in environmental science and a whole lot of romantic notions about living in the wilderness. For the most part, those notions have held up. There's a certain peace that comes with being surrounded by nature, a rhythm to the days, dictated by the rising and setting of the sun rather than the relentless tick of a clock. I've seen my share of incredible wildlife, elk grazing in the meadows at dawn, grizzlies lumbering through the underbrush, bald eagles soaring overhead with a regal indifference to the world below. I've helped lost hikers find their way back to the trails, patched up minor injuries, and even had the occasional bear encounter that got the adrenaline pumping. Standard park ranger stuff. The routine usually goes something like this. Wake up before sunrise in my small cabin, thankfully. I'm a decent distance from the main visitor center and get a bit more solitude than some of the other rangers. I make myself a strong cup of coffee, maybe two, and check the overnight reports. Anything from minor wildlife sightings to trail closures to the occasional illegal campfire. Then I'll head out, usually assigned to patrol a specific section of the park. Sometimes it's on foot, other times I'll take one of the park's trucks or even the ATV if I'm covering some of the more rugged backcountry. The days are filled with a mix of tasks: trail maintenance, clearing fallen logs, marking routes, ensuring everything is safe for visitors, visitor interaction, answering questions, providing information about the park's flora and fauna, reminding people about leave no trace principles, wildlife monitoring, keeping an eye on animal populations, noting any unusual behavior, and sometimes even assisting researchers with their studies. Evenings are usually spent catching up on paperwork, preparing for the next day, and maybe reading a book or two before turning in early. Like I said, routine, predictable, safe. But lately, that predictability has been, well, disrupted. It started subtly, almost imperceptibly at first. A few more reports of strange noises in the woods than usual. Hikers claiming they saw something moving just at the edge of their vision. Something that vanished before they could get a clear look. A couple of calls about unusual tracks that didn't quite match any of the animals known to inhabit the park. At the time, we mostly chalked it up to overactive imaginations, city folk getting spooked by the wilderness, maybe a misidentified animal here and there. It happens. Then the reports started getting weirder. A solo backpacker, a seasoned guy who'd hiked all over the Rockies, came in looking genuinely shaken. He claimed that while he was camped near one of the more remote alpine lakes, he heard a sound unlike anything he'd ever encountered before. He described it as a high-pitched whine, almost like metal scraping against metal, but with an unsettling organic quality to it. He said it circled his campsite for hours, moving through the trees just beyond the reach of his flashlight, and he never saw what was making the noise. He packed up before dawn and practically ran back to civilization. Another incident involved a group of birdwatchers, out early hoping to catch a glimpse of some of the rarer species in the area. They reported seeing a large, dark shape moving through the dense forest, something far too big to be a deer or a bear, and it moved with an unnatural speed and silence. They said it seemed to be watching them, its presence radiating an almost palpable sense of unease. They didn't stick around to find out what it was. We started taking these reports a little more seriously. My supervisor, a grizzled veteran named Dale who's seen just about everything in his 30-plus years with the Park Service, initially dismissed them as campfire stories getting out of hand. But even he started to look a little concerned when the frequency and the nature of the reports began to escalate. I remember one particular morning when I was going over the dispatch log. There were 3 new entries from the previous day that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The first was from a family camping in the valley near the Athabasca River. They claimed that sometime in the middle of the night, they were woken up by a series of loud, rhythmic thumping sounds coming from the surrounding woods. They said it sounded like something massive was hitting the ground, over and over again, and it continued for a good 20 minutes before suddenly stopping. They were too scared to leave their tent to investigate. The second report was from a couple hiking one of the trails leading up to Mount Edith Cavell. They said they found a series of strange markings on the trees along the path. These weren't the usual scratches left by bears or deer rubbing their antlers. These were deep, deliberate gouges, almost like something had taken a sharp blade and methodically carved symbols into the bark. They even took pictures on their phones, and when I saw them later, I had to admit they were unsettling. They looked almost intentional, but it was the third report that really got to me. It came from one of the other rangers, a young woman named Sarah who usually covers the backcountry trails on the eastern side of the park. She radioed in late in the afternoon, her voice tight with fear. She said she had been tracking a reported sighting of a lone wolf when she came across something else. She described it as a large structure built haphazardly from branches and logs, but far too big and too deliberately constructed to be a simple animal den. It was almost like someone or something had built a crude shelter deep in the woods. What made it even more disturbing was what she found inside. She said there were several animal carcasses scattered around the structure, not just the remains of typical prey animals like deer or elk, but also smaller creatures like foxes and coyotes, all arranged in a strange, almost ritualistic pattern. Sarah didn't stick around to investigate further. She marked the location on her GPS and got out of there as fast as she could. That evening, Dale called a meeting with all the on-duty rangers. The atmosphere in the briefing room was tense. We all knew something was going on, something beyond the usual run of the mill incidents we were used to dealing with. Dale, his face etched with a seriousness I hadn't seen before, laid out all the recent reports. He stressed the importance of vigilance and urged us to be extra cautious while on patrol. He also told us that he had contacted the provincial authorities and was waiting to hear back about whether they thought further investigation was necessary. In the meantime, we were told to keep our eyes and ears open, to document anything unusual, and to prioritize our safety above all else. We were also advised to carry our bear spray at all times, even in areas where bear encounters were less common. It felt like a shift, a subtle but significant change in the way we operated. The sense of routine had been replaced by a palpable undercurrent of unease. Over the next few days, the strange reports continued to trickle in. A hiker claimed to have seen a pair of glowing red eyes in the darkness. Another reported hearing a series of guttural growls that didn't sound like any known animal. One morning, a maintenance crew found several of the park's trail markers inexplicably uprooted and scattered along the path. Individually, these incidents might seem minor, easily dismissed, but taken together, they painted a picture of something off. Something was happening in Jasper, something we couldn't quite explain. Personally, I tried to remain skeptical. As a scientist, I tend to look for logical explanations for things. Maybe there was an undiscovered animal species in the park. Maybe some of the noises were just echoes or the wind playing tricks. Maybe the markings on the trees were the work of an unusually territorial animal. But even I had to admit that the sheer volume and the increasingly bizarre nature of the reports were starting to get under my skin. One afternoon, I was on patrol in the Malign Lake area, a particularly remote and heavily forested section of the park. The air was still and quiet, the only sounds the gentle rustling of leaves and the distant chirping of birds. I was hiking along a lesser used trail, checking for any signs of damage or unusual activity. As I rounded a bend, I noticed something that made me stop dead in my tracks. Sticking out of the ground near the edge of the trail was a bone. Not just any bone, but what looked like a human finger bone. It was bleached white and slightly weathered, but undeniably the shape and size of a human digit. My heart started to pound in my chest. Finding something like this out here was definitely not routine. I carefully knelt down and examined the area around the bone. I didn't see any other remains, no signs of disturbed earth, or any other indication of a burial site. It was just this single bone, sticking out of the dirt as if it had been deliberately placed there. A wave of unease washed over me. This wasn't just a strange noise or an unusual track. This was tangible, physical evidence of something potentially sinister. I pulled out my radio and contacted dispatch, reporting what I had found and requesting further instructions. While I waited for backup to arrive, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The silence of the forest seemed to press in on me. The shadows between the trees suddenly felt darker, more menacing. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made me jump. I gripped my bear spray a little tighter, my senses on high alert. This was no longer just about strange reports. This was something else entirely, and I had a sinking feeling that whatever was happening in Jasper, it was far from over. My routine was officially shattered, and I had a terrifying premonition that things were about to get a whole lot worse. The arrival of the other rangers felt like a huge weight lifted off my shoulders, even though I knew that the single bone we had found was just the beginning of whatever was going on. Two other rangers, Mark and Emily, showed up in a parked vehicle, their faces grim as they surveyed the scene. Mark was a burly guy with a no-nonsense attitude, while Emily was younger, fresh out of the academy, but sharp and observant. We cordoned off the immediate area with some caution, tape we always carried, just in case. Even though it was just a single bone, we treated it with the same level of care and respect as we would any potential crime scene. Protocol, you know. But honestly, it felt a little absurd, taping off a patch of dirt in the middle of the vast wilderness for a single, isolated bone. It just amplified the strangeness of the situation. Mark started taking photographs from different angles, meticulously documenting the bone's position in the surrounding area. Emily, meanwhile, carefully searched the ground nearby, her eyes scanning every inch of the forest floor for any other sign, more bones, perhaps some clothing, anything that might give us a clue about who this person was and how their finger ended up here. I stood there, feeling a knot of dread tightening in my stomach. The initial shock of the discovery was starting to wear off, replaced by a creeping sense of fear. This wasn't just an anomaly, it felt like a piece of a much larger, much darker puzzle. After a thorough search of the immediate vicinity yielded nothing else, we carefully placed the bone into an evidence bag. Dale had already been informed, and he said he would personally come out with the RCMP detachment that had jurisdiction over the park. This was definitely beyond our usual purview. We waited in silence for Dale and the Mounties to arrive, the air thick with unspoken questions and a growing sense of foreboding. The sun began to dip below the towering peaks, casting long, eerie shadows across the forest floor. The temperature dropped noticeably, and a chill wind whispered through the trees, making the leaves rustle like hushed voices. It was the kind of silence that wasn't peaceful, but expectant, like the world was holding its breath. It took a while for them to get to our location. The Malign Lake area is a fair distance from the main park headquarters, and accessing this particular trail required some off-roading. By the time Dale's truck and the RCMP vehicle arrived, the last vestiges of daylight were fading, and we had to rely on our flashlights to see. The RCMP officers, a man and a woman, were professional and efficient. They took over the scene, their demeanor serious as they listened to our account and examined the location where we found the bone. They conducted a more extensive search of the area, using specialized equipment and techniques that were beyond our training. They even brought along a cadaver dog, its keen nose sniffing through the underbrush. Despite their efforts, they didn't find anything else. No more bones, no clothing, no signs of a struggle, nothing that could help them identify the person or explain how their finger ended up in the middle of nowhere. The dog did pick up on something faint in the air, a scent that the officer handling it described as old and unidentifiable, but it didn't lead them to any other discoveries. As the hours passed and the search yielded no further results, a sense of frustration began to settle over the group. The officers bagged the bone and assured us that it would be sent for forensic analysis, but they admitted that without more evidence, it was unlikely they would be able to make much progress. They asked us to keep the location marked on our GPS and to report anything else we might find in the area. Dale looked grim as he addressed us. "All right, folks," he said, his voice low and serious. "The Mounties will handle the investigation from here, but I want all of you to remain vigilant. Whatever is going on in this park, it's not normal. We've had too many strange incidents lately for it to be coincidence. Stick to the main trails, work in pairs whenever possible, and if you see or hear anything out of the ordinary, report it immediately. Understood?" We all nodded in agreement. The discovery of the bone had definitely amplified the sense of unease that had been building over the past few weeks. It felt like we had crossed a threshold, moving from the realm of unexplained occurrences to something potentially dangerous. Over the next few weeks, the park remained on edge. The RCMP conducted a few more searches in the Malign Lake area, but they didn't find anything else related to the finger bone. The forensic analysis came back inconclusive. The bone was human, likely from an adult, but there was no way to determine their identity or the cause of death based on that single digit. The strange reports, however, didn't stop. If anything, they seemed to increase in frequency and intensity. More hikers reported strange noises, unexplained sightings, and an overwhelming feeling of being watched. One group claimed they found a collection of small animal bones arranged in a spiral pattern near one of the backcountry campsites. Another reported seeing a fleeting glimpse of a tall, shadowy figure moving through the trees at dusk, a figure that seemed to vanish into thin air. The atmosphere in the ranger station grew increasingly tense. We started having regular briefings where we shared any new information and discussed our concerns. Dale tried to maintain a calm and reassuring demeanor, but I could see the worry in his eyes. He knew as well as we did that something was wrong, something we didn't understand. Personally, I started to feel a sense of paranoia creeping in. Every shadow seemed to hold a potential threat. Every rustle in the underbrush made me jump. I found myself constantly scanning my surroundings, my hand never far from my bear spray. The solitude of the wilderness, which I had once found so comforting, now felt isolating and menacing. I started doing my own research, digging through old park records, local histories, and even some of the more obscure folklore about the region. I was looking for anything that might explain what was happening, any precedent for these strange occurrences. I came across a few old legends about mythical creatures said to inhabit the remote areas of the Rockies. Tales of shadowy figures and unearthly sounds, but I dismissed them as just that, legends. Old wives' tales meant to scare children around a campfire. But the rational part of my brain was starting to struggle to keep up with the mounting evidence of something truly strange. The finger bone, the increasing number of unsettling reports, the pervasive feeling that something was lurking just beyond our perception, it all pointed to something beyond the realm of normal, something unnatural. One particularly unsettling incident happened to me while I was on a solo patrol near the Valley of the Five Lakes. It was a beautiful sunny day, and the trails were relatively busy with hikers enjoying the scenery. I was taking a break by one of the lakes, eating my lunch and enjoying the tranquility. The water was crystal clear, reflecting the surrounding trees like a mirror. As I sat there, I started to hear a faint sound in the distance. At first, I couldn't quite make it out. It was a high-pitched, almost musical sound, like someone playing a flute or a similar instrument. It was a haunting melody, carried on the gentle breeze. Curiosity piqued. I stood up and tried to pinpoint the source of the sound. It seemed to be coming from deeper in the woods, away from the main trail. I hesitated for a moment, then decided to investigate. I figured it was probably just another hiker with a unique way of enjoying the park. I started walking in the direction of the sound, carefully making my way through the trees. The music grew louder as I went, the melody becoming clearer, more intricate. It was a beautiful tune, but there was something about it that felt unsettling. It had an almost ethereal quality, like it wasn't quite of this world. As I ventured further into the woods, the surrounding area became quieter. The usual sounds of birdsong and rustling leaves seemed to fade away, replaced only by the haunting melody of the flute. I started to feel a prickle of unease. This was getting a little too strange. Then, the music suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. It felt heavy, oppressive, like the air itself had become thick and still. I stood there for a moment, listening intently, but there was no sound, not even the gentle breeze I had felt moments before. I decided to turn back. Whatever that was, it was giving me the creeps. As I started to retrace my steps, I noticed something on the ground that I hadn't seen before. It was a small, intricately carved wooden flute, lying abandoned amongst the fallen leaves. I cautiously approached it and picked it up. It was beautifully crafted, the wood smooth and polished, adorned with strange symbols that I didn't recognize. It felt strangely cold to the touch. I examined it for a few moments, a sense of bewilderment washing over me. Who would leave such a beautiful instrument behind? And what was that music I had heard? As I held the flute in my hand, I suddenly felt a presence behind me. A cold dread washed over me, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I could feel eyes on me, watching me from the shadows. I slowly turned around, my hand instinctively reaching for my bear spray, but there was nothing there. Just the silent, still forest. I stood there for a long moment, my heart pounding in my chest, my senses on high alert. But there was no sign of anyone or anything. Just the oppressive silence and the feeling of being watched. I clutched the flute tightly in my hand and practically ran back towards the main trail, not stopping until I could see other hikers in the distance. I didn't look back. I just wanted to get out of those woods. When I got back to the ranger station, I showed Dale the flute and told him about the music I had heard. He looked at the flute with a mixture of curiosity and concern. He said he had never seen anything like it before. We tried to figure out what the symbols on the flute meant, but none of us recognized them. Dale took some pictures of the flute and said he would try to get in touch with some experts who might be able to identify it. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me in the woods. I kept replaying the haunting melody in my mind, and the feeling of being watched lingered like a shadow. I put the flute in a sealed evidence bag and locked it in my locker. I didn't want to touch it again. Sleep didn't come easy that night. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle of leaves outside my window made me jump. I kept thinking about the finger bone, the strange reports, and the haunting music in the woods. It felt like all these disparate pieces were starting to come together, forming a picture that was both terrifying and incomprehensible. I knew one thing for sure: whatever was happening in Jasper National Park was far from over. and I had a growing fear that we were only scratching the surface of something ancient, something malevolent, something that had been lurking in the wilderness for a very long time and was now starting to make its presence known. Days turned into weeks, and the strange occurrences in Jasper continued unabated. The flute remained an enigma. The experts Dale contacted couldn't identify the wood, the carving style, or the symbols etched into its surface. It was like it belonged to no culture or time period they were familiar with. Eventually, it was sent off to a more specialized lab for further analysis, but we didn't hold our breath for any definitive answers. The atmosphere in the park was thick with a nervous tension. Visitors, though initially drawn by the stunning scenery, started to feel the unease. Whispers of strange sightings and unexplained phenomena circulated through the campgrounds and along the trails. Some even started leaving early, cutting their trips short. Our job shifted from routine maintenance and visitor assistance to managing fear and trying to reassure people that everything was under control, a lie we all knew deep down. I found myself increasingly drawn to the more remote areas of the park, the places where the reports seemed to originate. There was a morbid curiosity pulling me, a need to understand what was happening in our wilderness. I started spending my days off hiking deeper into the backcountry, venturing off the marked trails, looking for any sign, any clue that might shed light on the mystery. One afternoon, I was exploring an area north of Malign Lake, a dense, old-growth forest that rarely saw human traffic. The trees here were ancient giants, their gnarled branches reaching up towards the sky like skeletal fingers. The sunlight struggled to penetrate the thick canopy, casting the forest floor in a perpetual twilight. It was a place where you could easily believe in things that went bump in the night. As I hiked, I kept my senses on high alert, listening for any unusual sounds, watching for any strange signs. The silence of the forest here was different from other areas of the park. It wasn't a peaceful silence, it was heavy, expectant, almost predatory. Suddenly I heard it again, the music. It was faint at first, carried on the breeze, but as I moved further into the woods, it grew louder, clearer. It was the same haunting melody I had heard near the Valley of the Five Lakes, the ethereal notes of the flute weaving through the trees. This time, I wasn't just curious. I was determined to find the source of the music. I followed the sound, pushing through thick underbrush, scrambling over fallen logs. The melody seemed to be leading me deeper and deeper into the heart of the forest. As I got closer, I noticed a change in the environment. The trees started to look twisted, their trunks contorted into unnatural shapes, their branches gnarled and bare even though it wasn't winter. The air grew colder, and an unsettling feeling washed over me, a primal sense of fear that told me I was venturing into a place I shouldn't be. Then I saw it. In a small clearing bathed in an eerie, pale light that seemed to emanate from nowhere, stood a figure. It was tall and gaunt, its form obscured by shadows, but I could tell it was human, or at least humanoid. It was facing away from me, its back to the trees, and it was playing the flute. The music that emanated from the instrument was even more haunting up close, the notes resonating with an almost physical intensity. It felt like the music was reaching into my very soul, stirring up emotions I couldn't name, filling me with a profound sense of dread. I froze, unable to move, my heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to run, to turn and flee back to the familiar trails, but something held me rooted to the spot, a morbid fascination with the scene unfolding before me. As I watched, the figure slowly turned its head, its movement jerky and unnatural. Its face was hidden in shadow, but I could see two glowing red eyes fixed on me, burning like embers in the dim light. A wave of pure terror washed over me. This was it. This was what had been haunting the park, the source of the strange reports, the reason for the growing unease. This was something not of this world. The figure stopped playing the flute, and the silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the frantic beating of my own heart. The glowing red eyes continued to stare at me, and I felt an icy grip of fear paralyze me. Then the figure began to move. It glided towards me, its movements silent and unnervingly fast, like it was floating across the forest floor. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I tried to move my legs, but they felt like lead. As the figure drew closer, I could make out more details. Its skin was pale and stretched taut over sharp bones, its limbs long and thin. It wore tattered clothes that looked like they had been ripped and torn by the wilderness, and in its hand, it still held the flute. It stopped just a few feet away from me, its red eyes boring into mine. I could feel a cold, malevolent presence emanating from it, a sense of ancient hunger and something else, something I couldn't quite comprehend. It raised the flute to its lips again, and I knew, with a terrifying certainty, that the music it was about to play wasn't meant for listening. It was meant for something else. Just as its lips touched the flute, I finally found my voice. It was a strangled, desperate scream, ripped from the depths of my lungs. And in that moment, the spell seemed to break. The figure recoiled slightly, its red eyes flickering. I seized the opportunity, turning and running as fast as I could, back the way I had come. I didn't look back, didn't dare to see if it was following me. I just ran, my lungs burning, my heart pounding, every muscle in my body screaming in protest. I didn't stop running until I burst out of the dense forest and onto a familiar trail, where I finally collapsed, gasping for breath. I lay there for a long time, shaking uncontrollably, my mind reeling from what I had seen. When I finally managed to gather myself, I stumbled back towards the ranger station, my body aching, my mind still filled with the image of those glowing red eyes. I told Dale everything that had happened, my voice trembling as I recounted my encounter in the woods. He listened intently, his face growing increasingly pale as I spoke. He didn't dismiss my story. He had seen the reports, he had felt the unease, and I knew he believed me. We immediately contacted the authorities, and a full-scale search of the area was launched. Rangers, police officers, even a search and rescue team scoured the woods where I had seen the figure. But they found nothing. No clearing bathed in pale light, no strange, twisted trees, no sign of the figure I had encountered. They did find something else, though. Near the location where I had originally heard the music, by the Valley of the Five Lakes, they found more bones. This time, it wasn't just a single finger bone. They found a scattered collection of human remains, partially buried beneath a layer of leaves and moss. The bones were old, weathered, but undeniably human. The discovery sent a fresh wave of fear through the park. The RCMP launched a full-scale investigation, trying to identify the remains and determine how they ended up there. But the initial assessment suggested that the bones had been there for a very long time, possibly decades. As for the figure I saw, it vanished without a trace. Despite extensive searches, they found no evidence of its existence. No footprints, no discarded clothing, nothing. Some people started to speculate that I had imagined it, that the stress and the atmosphere in the park had gotten to me. But I knew what I had seen. I knew the fear I had felt was real, and I knew that whatever that thing was, it was still out there, somewhere in the vast wilderness of Jasper National Park. The park remained open, but things were different now. The carefree joy that once filled the air had been replaced by a palpable sense of fear and uncertainty. Hikers were more cautious, sticking to the main trails, traveling in larger groups. The rangers were on high alert, our patrols taking on a new level of seriousness. As for me, I still work as a park ranger in Jasper. I couldn't bring myself to leave. Part of me feels a responsibility to understand what is happening here, to protect the park and its visitors from whatever lurks in the shadows. I still go out on patrol every day, but now I carry more than just bear spray. I carry a deep-seated fear, a constant awareness that we are not alone in these woods. And sometimes when the wind whispers through the trees just right, I can almost hear it, the faint, haunting melody of a flute carried on the breeze. And I know with a chilling certainty that the song is not over. It's just waiting to be played again. My name is Emily, and for the past 3 years, Mark has been the steady, comforting anchor in my occasionally chaotic life. He's the kind of guy who leaves little notes in my lunch bag, always remembers my coffee order, and has a laugh that can chase away even the gloomiest of moods. So, when he suggested a romantic getaway to a secluded cabin in the woods of British Columbia, I jumped at the chance. City life, with its constant sirens and overflowing inboxes, had started to feel like a persistent hum beneath my skin, and the idea of crisp mountain air and the quiet rustle of leaves was exactly what I craved. We'd spent weeks poring over listings online, searching for that perfect blend of rustic charm and comfortable isolation. Mark, ever the meticulous planner, had meticulously checked reviews, cross-referenced locations on maps, and even called the rental company multiple times with what I affectionately called his interrogation sessions. Finally, we settled on a place nestled deep within a sprawling forest, a few hours' drive from the nearest town. The pictures painted a cozy scene, a log cabin with a stone fireplace, large windows overlooking a seemingly endless expanse of trees, and a porch swing that looked perfect for lazy afternoons with a book. The listing mentioned it was unplugged. No Wi-Fi or cell service, which initially gave me pause, but Mark had argued that it would force us to truly disconnect and focus on each other. He'd even packed a vintage map and a compass, a playful nod to a simpler time. The drive itself was breathtaking. As we ventured further away from the highway, the landscape transformed. Towering pine trees replaced the familiar urban sprawl, and the air grew noticeably cooler and cleaner, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine needles. Sunlight filtered through the dense canopy, creating dappled patterns on the winding road. We rolled down the windows, letting the sounds of nature wash over us, the chirping of unseen birds, the distant rush of a creek, the whisper of the wind through the leaves. Mark, behind the wheel, kept glancing over at me with a wide, excited grin. He loved the outdoors, and his enthusiasm was infectious. "Isn't this amazing, Em?" he asked, his voice filled with genuine awe. "It's beautiful, Mark," I replied, leaning my head against the passenger window, already feeling a sense of peace I hadn't realized I'd been missing. After what felt like an eternity on increasingly narrow, unpaved roads, we finally reached our destination. The cabin was even more secluded than the pictures had suggested. It sat in a small clearing, surrounded by a dense wall of trees that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. There were no other buildings in sight, just the cabin in the wild, untamed forest. It was exactly the kind of isolation we had hoped for. The cabin itself was charmingly rustic, as advertised. The logs were weathered and worn, hinting at years of withstanding the elements. A plume of smoke curled from the stone chimney, a welcoming sign that the caretakers had likely prepared the place before our arrival. The porch swing looked just as inviting as it did in the photos, swaying gently in the light breeze. As we pulled up to the front, the only sound was the crunch of gravel beneath the tires and the continued whisper of the wind. It was eerily quiet, a stark contrast to the constant noise I was used to. We unpacked the car, our voices echoing in the stillness. Mark insisted on carrying the heavier bags, his chivalrous nature always shining through. As I followed him up the porch steps, I noticed a small, hand-carved wooden sign hanging beside the door. It read, "Whispering Pines." It felt a little cliché, but somehow fitting for our secluded retreat. Inside, the cabin was cozy and dimly lit. Sunlight filtered through the lace-curtained windows, casting soft shadows on the wooden floors and walls. A thick braided rug lay in front of the stone fireplace, and the scent of wood smoke and something vaguely floral hung in the air. It felt lived in, comfortable, and exactly the escape we needed. "Wow, this is perfect," I breathed, taking in the details. There were antique lamps on the side tables, a collection of well-worn books on a shelf, and even a small vase filled with wildflowers on the mantelpiece. Mark dropped the bags with a satisfied sigh. "Told you I'd find the perfect spot." He wrapped his arms around me from behind, resting his chin on my shoulder. "Just you and me, miles away from everything." I leaned back into his embrace, feeling a wave of contentment wash over me. This was exactly what we both needed. A chance to reconnect, to relax, to simply be present with each other. We spent the afternoon exploring the cabin, unpacking our things, and getting acquainted with our surroundings. The kitchen was small but well equipped, with a vintage stove and a collection of mismatched dishes. We found a stack of old board games in a cupboard, a reminder of simpler evenings spent disconnected from technology. Upstairs, the bedroom had a large window that offered a stunning view of the forest, the branches of the trees almost close enough to touch. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the clearing, Mark started a fire in the fireplace. The crackling flames filled the cabin with a warm, comforting glow. We settled onto the rug with a bottle of wine and a cheese board, talking and laughing, the stresses of our everyday lives slowly melting away. Later, as darkness enveloped the cabin, the silence outside seemed to deepen. The only sounds were the crackling fire, the gentle ticking of an old grandfather clock in the corner, and our own soft voices. It was a peaceful silence, the kind that felt restorative. We talked for hours, sharing stories and dreams, the intimacy of the secluded setting fostering a sense of closeness that sometimes got lost in the hustle of city life. Eventually, the fire died down to glowing embers, and a comfortable wariness settled over us. We climbed the creaking wooden stairs to the bedroom, the moonlight casting an ethereal glow through the window. Mark had already pulled back the covers, and the bed looked incredibly inviting. As I snuggled under the warm blankets, feeling Mark's arm wrap around me, a sense of deep contentment settled over me. This was exactly what I had hoped for. a perfect romantic getaway in a beautiful, secluded cabin. But as I drifted off to sleep, a faint, unsettling feeling began to creep into the edges of my peacefulness. It was nothing specific, just a subtle sense of unease, like a tiny, discordant note in an otherwise harmonious melody. Perhaps it was just the unfamiliar silence of the woods, the lack of the usual city sounds that I had grown so accustomed to. Or maybe it was the way the shadows seemed to dance and shift in the moonlight, playing tricks on my eyes. Whatever it was a fleeting feeling, easily dismissed as the overactive imagination of someone unused to such profound solitude. Little did I know, this feeling was just the first whisper of the nightmare that was about to unfold. The secluded cabin in the woods of British Columbia, our chosen haven of romance and tranquility, held secrets far darker and more terrifying than anything I could have ever imagined. And as the night deepened, those secrets were beginning to stir. I woke up the next morning feeling surprisingly refreshed, despite the lingering shadow of unease from the night before. The cabin was filled with a soft, golden light filtering through the bedroom window, and the air had a crisp, clean scent. Mark was still sound asleep beside me, his face relaxed and peaceful. I watched him for a moment, a familiar warmth spreading through me. He truly was my anchor, my constant in a world that sometimes felt like it was spinning too fast. I carefully slipped out of bed, trying not to wake him, and went downstairs. The cabin was quiet, save for the gentle creaking of the old wooden floorboards. I made a pot of coffee, the rich aroma filling the air, and then stepped out onto the porch. The forest was bathed in the early morning light, the trees casting long, intricate shadows across the clearing. A light mist hung in the air, giving the landscape an almost ethereal quality. It was beautiful, undeniably so, but there was also a sense of stillness, an almost unnatural quiet that still felt a little unsettling. I sat on the porch swing, sipping my coffee and listening to the sounds of the awakening forest. Birds began to chirp, their melodies echoing through the trees. A squirrel scampered up a nearby pine, its claws scratching against the bark. The distant rush of a creek, which I hadn't noticed the night before, became more pronounced. Slowly, the sense of unease from the previous night began to dissipate, replaced by a feeling of tranquility. This was the peace I had been craving, the chance to escape the noise and stress of city life. Mark joined me on the porch a little while later, rubbing the sleep from his eyes and grinning at me. "Morning, sleepyhead," I said, handing him a mug of coffee. "Morning?" he mumbled, taking a sip. "Smells amazing." He looked out at the forest, taking a deep breath. "This is exactly what we needed, isn't it?" "It is," I agreed, leaning my head on his shoulder. "It's perfect." We spent the morning hiking on some of the trails we had found marked near the cabin. The air was cool and invigorating, and the scenery was breathtaking. Towering trees reached towards the sky, their branches intertwined like ancient fingers. Sunlight streamed through the canopy, illuminating patches of moss, covered ground and wildflowers in vibrant hues. We walked hand in hand, talking and laughing, enjoying the simple pleasure of each other's company in such a beautiful setting. As we ventured deeper into the woods, however, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. It wasn't a menacing feeling, not exactly, but more like a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, a sense that something was observing us from the shadows. I glanced around frequently, half expecting to see a deer or some other woodland creature, but we never saw anything. "Everything all right, Em?" Mark asked, noticing my unease. "Yeah, just a little jumpy, I guess," I replied, trying to sound casual. "Just feels like we're not alone out here." Mark chuckled. "Of course we're not alone. There are probably all sorts of animals around." I know, I said, but the feeling persisted. It was more than just the presence of wildlife. It felt like something else, something unseen. We returned to the cabin in the late afternoon, our legs tired but our spirits refreshed. We spent the rest of the day relaxing by the fire, reading and playing board games. As the sun began to set, casting a warm, orange glow through the windows, I started to feel that unsettling feeling from the previous night creeping back in. The shadows in the corners of the cabin seemed to deepen and lengthen, and the silence outside felt heavier, more profound. After dinner, as we were washing the dishes, we heard it for the first time. A faint scratching sound coming from somewhere outside the cabin. It was a subtle sound, almost easily dismissed as the wind rustling through the leaves or a small animal moving around. But there was something about it, a persistent, rhythmic quality that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. Did you hear that? I whispered to Mark, my hand freezing mid-wash. He stopped drying the dishes, his brow furrowed.
Hear what?
That scratching sound, it's like right outside. We both stood still, listening intently. After a moment, we heard it again, clearer this time. A distinct scratching sound, as if something with sharp claws was scraping against the wooden walls of the cabin. Maybe it's just a raccoon or something, Mark said, trying to sound reassuring, but I could see the flicker of unease in his eyes. We went to the window and peered out into the darkness, but we couldn't see anything. The darkness was thick and impenetrable, the trees forming a solid black wall around the clearing. The only light came from the warm glow emanating from the cabin windows, which seemed to emphasize the darkness beyond. The scratching sound continued sporadically throughout the evening, each time sending a shiver down my spine. We tried to ignore it, telling ourselves it was just some harmless animal, but the persistent nature of the sound and the fact that we couldn't see anything made it increasingly difficult to dismiss. As the night wore on, the sounds became more varied. Along with the scratching, we started hearing faint rustling noises in the leaves surrounding the cabin, and occasionally a soft, almost imperceptible tapping sound like someone gently knocking on the wall. "I don't like this," I said to Mark, my voice barely above a whisper. We were sitting by the dying embers of the fire, both of us tense and on edge. "It's probably nothing, Em," he said, but his eyes betrayed his concern. "Just animals. We're in the middle of the woods, after all." But it didn't feel like just animals. There was something about the way the sounds seemed to move around the cabin, as if whatever was out there was circling us, watching us. As we finally retreated to the bedroom, the sounds followed us. The scratching seemed to come from just outside the walls, and the rustling in the leaves sounded like something was moving just beyond the window. I pulled the covers up to my chin, feeling a cold knot of fear tightening in my stomach. "Maybe we should have gotten a cabin with Wi-Fi," I said, only half joking. Mark reached out and took my hand, his touch surprisingly cold. "We'll be fine, Em. Just try to relax." But relaxation was impossible. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle of leaves outside sent a jolt of anxiety through me. I lay there in the darkness, my senses on high alert, listening to the unsettling symphony of the woods. Then, just as I thought I was finally starting to drift off to sleep, we heard a new sound. It was faint at first, almost like a whisper carried on the wind. But it grew steadily louder, morphing into a low, guttural moan that seemed to come from the depths of the forest. It was a sound that resonated deep within my bones, a sound that spoke of pain, of suffering, of something ancient and malevolent. I squeezed Mark's hand, my heart pounding in my chest. "What was that?" I whispered, my voice trembling. He was silent for a moment, his grip on my hand tightening. "I don't know," he finally said, his voice barely audible. He sounded scared, truly scared for the first time since we had arrived. The moaning sound faded away, leaving behind an even more unsettling silence. But then it started again, closer this time, and accompanied by a new sound, a slow, deliberate thumping, as if something large and heavy was moving through the underbrush towards the cabin. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through me. This wasn't just animals. This was something else, something unwelcome, something that felt ancient and dark. The thumping grew louder and closer, and then we heard it right outside our bedroom window. A heavy thud against the wooden wall, followed by a scraping sound that was definitely not the wind. I held my breath, my eyes wide with terror, staring into the darkness. I could feel Mark's body beside me trembling. Whatever was out there was no longer just whispering in the woods. It was here, and it was getting closer. Our romantic getaway had officially turned into a nightmare, and I had a terrifying feeling that this was only the beginning. The heavy thud against the wall outside our bedroom sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through me. My breath hitched in my throat, and my eyes darted around the dimly lit room, as if searching for answers in the shadows. Mark's grip on my hand tightened to the point of pain, and I could feel his entire body vibrating with fear. The scraping sound that followed was even more unsettling. It sounded like rough claws dragging against the wood, leaving a trail of deep gouges. It went on for what felt like an eternity, a horrifying soundtrack to our petrified silence. Then silence, a thick, heavy silence that felt even more oppressive than the strange noises had been. We lay there, frozen, listening for any indication of what was happening outside. The only sound was the frantic thumping of my own heart in my ears. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, Mark whispered, his voice hoarse. What do you think it is? I shook my head, unable to speak. My mind was racing, trying to come up with some rational explanation, but the raw terror I felt made it impossible to think clearly. A large animal, maybe a bear. But the sounds, the moaning, the deliberate thumping, the scraping, it didn't sound like any animal I knew. Suddenly, a new sound broke the silence. A slow, deliberate creaking sound coming from downstairs. It sounded like someone was walking through the cabin, their weight causing the old wooden floorboards to groan. My blood ran cold. We had locked the front door. There was no other way in. Terror seized me, a primal, visceral fear that stripped away any semblance of rational thought. I squeezed Mark's hand so hard my knuckles ached. He squeezed back just as tightly. The creaking continued, each step seeming to get closer to the bottom of the stairs. We held our breath, listening with every fiber of our being. Then the creaking stopped. A moment of agonizing silence hung in the air, and then we heard it, a soft, almost childlike humming coming from just outside our bedroom door. It was a tuneless, off-key melody, deeply unsettling in its innocent simplicity. My breath caught in my throat. This was beyond any animal. This was something else entirely. Something human, or perhaps something that had once been human. The humming stopped, replaced by a soft scratching sound against the bedroom door. It was a light, delicate scratching, like fingernails gently tracing patterns on the wood. I wanted to scream, but no sound would come out. My body was completely paralyzed by fear. I could feel Mark's heart pounding against mine, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The scratching stopped, and for a moment we dared to hope that whatever it was had gone away. But then the humming started again, right on the other side of the door. Closer now, more insistent. Suddenly, the doorknob began to turn. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the latch clicked open. We stared at the door, our eyes wide with unadulterated terror. The door creaked inward, revealing a sliver of darkness beyond. The humming stopped abruptly. A long, spindly shadow stretched across the floor from the doorway, elongated and distorted by the low light filtering from the hallway. It looked impossibly thin and frail, yet there was something deeply menacing about its stillness. Then a sound, a wet, smacking sound like lips being parted. And then a whisper so faint we almost didn't hear it. Emily. It called my name. A chill that had nothing to do with the temperature in the room washed over me. How did it know my name? Mark reacted instantly. He threw the covers back and scrambled out of bed, placing himself between the door and me. He was shaking, but his eyes held a fierce protectiveness. Who's there? He called out, his voice trembling but firm. What do you want? Silence. The shadow remained still in the doorway. Then another whisper, this time closer, right on the other side of the doorframe. Mark. It knew his name too. Suddenly, the humming started again, louder this time, almost frantic. The shadow seemed to twitch and writhe in the doorway. Mark grabbed the heavy wooden bedside lamp and held it up like a weapon. Jet away from our door, he yelled, his voice cracking with fear and adrenaline. The shadow recoiled slightly, and the humming stopped again. For a moment, I thought it might actually leave. But then, the scratching started again, this time on the doorframe itself, vicious and insistent. We huddled together, our eyes glued to the doorway, waiting for whatever horror lay beyond to make its next move. The air was thick with tension, the silence punctuated only by our ragged breathing. Suddenly, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang, making us both jump. The latch clicked back into place. We were locked in again, but the scratching didn't stop. It continued on the other side of the door, more frantic now, accompanied by soft, desperate whimpers. We stayed huddled together until the first hint of dawn began to filter through the window. As the light grew stronger, the scratching and whimpering gradually faded away, replaced by the familiar sounds of the awakening forest. When we finally dared to open the door, the hallway was empty. There was no sign of whatever had been on the other side. Downstairs, the cabin was just as we had left it. The fire had long since died out, and the morning light streamed through the windows, casting long shadows. Everything looked normal, almost peaceful, but the memory of the terror we had felt during the night was still raw and vivid. We didn't stay any longer. We packed our bags quickly, our movements jerky and uncoordinated. We didn't talk much, the shared horror of the night hanging heavy in the air between us. As we drove away from the cabin, I looked back at the clearing, at the small wooden structure nestled amongst the trees. It looked innocent, serene, bathed in the morning sunlight. But I knew the darkness it held, the unseen presence that had whispered our names in the dead of night. We didn't stop driving until we reached the nearest town, a small, sleepy place with a gas station and a diner. We went inside the diner, ordered coffee, and sat in silence for a long time, trying to process what had happened. We never went back to the cabin. We never spoke of it again, except in hushed whispers on sleepless nights. The memory of the scratching, the humming, the voice that called our names in the darkness remained etched in our minds, a constant reminder of the terror we had experienced in the woods of British Columbia. To this day, I still get a shiver down my spine whenever I hear the wind rustling through the trees at night. And sometimes, just sometimes, I think I hear a faint, almost childlike humming carried on the breeze, a chilling reminder that some nightmares don't stay confined to our dreams. Some linger in the quiet places, waiting for their next victims. And sometimes they know your name. My name is Ben, and I've spent the better part of my adult life chasing the perfect shot. Not the kind you get in a studio, all posed in perfect lighting, but the raw, untamed beauty of the natural world. I'm a wildlife photographer, and for me, there's nothing more exhilarating than being out in the field, the air thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. The only sounds the rustling of leaves and the distant call of some unseen creature. I thrive in the solitude, the feeling of being the only human eye witnessing moments that unfold far from the paved roads and chattering crowds. That's what brought me to Newfoundland. I'd seen the documentaries, pored over the photographs, towering fords carved by ancient glaciers, vast stretches of boreal forest teeming with life, and a rugged coastline where the wild Atlantic crashes against the shore. It was a photographer's dream, a place where you could spend weeks, even months, and still not capture all the wonders it had to offer. My focus for this trip was primarily on the local fauna. I'd heard tales of moose larger than any I'd seen before, elusive pine martens flitting through the undergrowth, and seabirds congregating in massive colonies along the cliffs. And, of course, the possibility of catching a glimpse of whales breaching in the distance held a certain magic. I arrived in late October. The summer crowds had long since departed, leaving the island to the locals and a handful of intrepid travelers like myself. The air had a crisp bite to it, carrying the promise of an early winter. The leaves on the deciduous trees that dotted the landscape were in their final fiery display of reds, oranges, and yellows, creating a stunning contrast against the deep greens of the evergreens. I rented a sturdy SUV in St. John's, loaded it up with my gear cameras, lenses of all shapes and sizes, a tripod that had seen more wilderness than most people, and enough camping equipment to survive a small apocalypse. My initial plan was to explore Grosmore National Park, a UNESCO World Heritage Site renowned for its geological wonders and diverse ecosystems. I spent the first week hiking through its valleys, marveling at the tablelands, a stark, otherworldly landscape of rust-colored rock that felt like another planet. I captured stunning images of the fjord, like Western Brook Pond, its sheer cliffs plunging into the still, dark water. I even managed to photograph a few caribou grazing peacefully in a meadow, their breath misting in the cool morning air. It was everything I had hoped for, and my camera roll was filling up with images I knew I'd cherish. But as the week drew to a close, I felt a familiar itch, a yearning for something more remote, something a little less trodden. Grosmorn was beautiful, undeniably, but it also had well-marked trails and a certain degree of accessibility. I wanted to venture further off the beaten path, to immerse myself in the true wilderness of Newfoundland. I started poring over maps, looking for areas that seemed less populated, more rugged. My finger eventually landed on a region on the eastern side of the island, a vast expanse of forests and bogs that stretched towards a less visited section of the coastline. There were a few small towns marked, but for the most part, it looked like prime, untouched wilderness. The kind of place where you could lose yourself literally and figuratively. After stocking up on supplies in a small coastal town, I headed inland, following a winding gravel road that seemed to disappear deeper and deeper into the woods. The paved roads soon gave way to rougher tracks, and eventually, I was navigating a narrow, unmaintained logging road, the SUV bouncing and rattling over the uneven terrain. The forest closed in around me, the trees towering overhead, their branches forming a dense canopy that filtered out most of the sunlight. It was quiet, eerily so, with only the sound of my own engine and the occasional bird call breaking the silence. I found a small clearing near a stream, a perfect spot to set up camp. It was secluded, surrounded by thick forest, and the sound of the running water was soothing. As I pitched my tent and unpacked my gear, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was truly alone out here. It wasn't a bad feeling, not at first. It was the kind of solitude I craved, the feeling of being completely self-reliant, the world reduced to just me in the wilderness. The first few days in this new location were productive. I spent my mornings tracking wildlife, setting up camera traps in promising locations, and exploring the surrounding area. I saw evidence of moose and deer, found fresh tracks that I couldn't quite identify, and heard strange calls echoing through the forest at night. I even managed to get some incredible shots of a family of beavers constructing their dam in the nearby stream. As the days turned into nights, however, a subtle unease began to creep in. It wasn't anything specific, just a general feeling of being watched, a prickling sensation on the back of my neck when I was alone in the woods. I started being more careful, more aware of my surroundings. I made sure to have my bear spray readily accessible and kept a fire going at night, even when the temperature didn't necessarily warrant it. One afternoon, I decided to venture deeper into the forest than I had before. I followed a faint animal trail that led me away from the stream and into a denser section of woods, where the trees were older and larger, their gnarled roots snaking across the forest floor. The air here was cooler, damper, and the silence was more profound, broken only by the occasional snap of a twig under my boots. I was so engrossed in looking for signs of wildlife that I almost missed it. A flash of movement out of the corner of my eye caught my attention. I froze, my hand instinctively reaching for my camera. There, partially obscured by a thicket of ferns, was an animal unlike anything I had ever seen before. It was large, bigger than a wolf, with a powerful build and long, sinuous limbs. Its fur was dark, almost black, and seemed to absorb the light, making it difficult to make out its exact features. Its head was low to the ground, and it appeared to be sniffing at something in the undergrowth. I couldn't see its eyes clearly, but I had the distinct impression that they were watching me, even though its head was turned away. My heart started pounding in my chest. This wasn't a moose, or a bear, or any other animal I was familiar with from this region. It moved with a strange, almost fluid grace, its body low and agile. I slowly raised my camera, my hands trembling slightly, and started snapping pictures, hoping to capture as much detail as possible before it disappeared. The creature remained there for what felt like an eternity, though it was probably only a minute or two. Then, with a suddenness that made me jump, it raised its head. That's when I saw its face. It wasn't the face of a wolf or a dog or even a bear. It was more primate-like, but with sharp, pointed features and a disturbingly wide mouth filled with rows of teeth that seemed too large, too sharp for any animal I knew. Its eyes, which were now fixed on me, were large and black, and they held an intelligence that sent a shiver down my spine. It wasn't just looking at me, it was observing me. A low growl rumbled from its chest, a sound that was both guttural and somehow wrong. It wasn't the kind of growl I associated with a wild animal defending its territory. This sound felt ancient, predatory, and filled with a chilling awareness. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. It melted back into the shadows of the forest, leaving me standing there, my camera still clutched in my hands, my heart still racing. I lowered the camera and looked at the spot where it had been. There was nothing there, just the ferns, the trees, and the unsettling silence of the woods. I stood there for a long moment, trying to process what I had just seen. My mind raced, trying to categorize the creature, to fit it into some known biological framework. But it was no use. Nothing I could think of matched the description of the animal I had just encountered. A wave of fear washed over me, cold and sharp. I was alone, deep in the wilderness, and I had just seen something that shouldn't exist. Something else. I knew I couldn't stay there any longer. I had to get back to my camp, back to some semblance of safety. I turned and practically ran back the way I had come, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The familiar sounds of the forest, the rustling leaves, the chirping birds now seemed menacing, filled with hidden threats. Every shadow seemed to conceal a pair of watchful eyes. I stumbled back into my clearing, my legs burning, my chest heaving. My tent stood there, a small beacon of familiarity in the encroaching darkness. I quickly built up the fire, adding more and more wood until it was blazing, the flames casting flickering shadows that danced around the clearing. I grabbed my laptop and plugged in my camera, my hands still shaking as I transferred the images. I scrolled through them quickly, my heart pounding as I searched for the shots of the creature. And there it was, captured in a series of grainy, slightly blurry photographs. The dark fur, the powerful build, the unsettling face with its wide mouth and intelligent black eyes. Looking at the images on the screen, the reality of what I had seen sank in. It wasn't a trick of the light or a misidentification. I had photographed something truly unknown, something that science couldn't explain. I sat by the fire late into the night, staring at the photos on my laptop, the unsettling growl echoing in my memory. The solitude I had once craved now felt like a terrifying vulnerability. I was out here alone, with evidence of something extraordinary, something potentially dangerous, and I had no idea what to do next. Sleep didn't come easy that night. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, outside my tent sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. The images of the creature were burned into my mind, that unsettling face, the intelligent black eyes. It felt like something primal, something that had no place in the modern world. Yet here it was, in the wilds of Newfoundland. The next morning, the forest seemed different. The sunlight filtering through the trees felt weaker, the birdsong less cheerful. There was a heavy stillness in the air, a sense of anticipation that made my skin crawl. I ate a quick breakfast of granola and coffee, my eyes constantly scanning the surrounding woods. Every shadow looked like it could be hiding something. Every sound made me jump. I knew I couldn't stay in that clearing. The thought of encountering that creature again filled me with a deep, visceral fear. But at the same time, a part of me, the photographer in me, was desperate to learn more. What was it? Where did it come from? Was I the only one who had ever seen it? I decided to pack up my camp. I wanted to put some distance between myself and that place, but I also didn't want to abandon the area entirely. Perhaps if I was careful, I could observe it from a safer distance, maybe even get more photographs. As I dismantled my tent, I noticed something I had missed the day before. Near where I had seen the creature, the ground was disturbed. There were no clear footprints, the forest floor being a mix of soft earth and pine needles, but there were patches where the undergrowth had been flattened, as if something heavy had been moving through it. I followed the disturbed area for a short distance, but it eventually faded into the dense foliage. Whatever it was strong and agile. I loaded all my gear back into the SUV, my movements quick and efficient, driven by a nervous energy. As I pulled away from the clearing, I glanced back one last time, half expecting to see those black eyes staring out from the trees. But there was nothing. I drove slowly down the logging road, my senses on high alert. Every shadow seemed to shift. Every gust of wind through the trees sounded like a whisper. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something was tracking my movements through the forest. I eventually reached the main gravel road and felt a small sense of relief. The forest here was a little less dense, and there was a slight increase in the sounds of civilization, the distant drone of a logging truck, the faint hum of electricity from power lines somewhere in the distance. I drove to a small, isolated motel a few miles down the road, a place that looked like it hadn't seen many guests in recent years. It was exactly what I needed, a place to rest, to process what I had seen, and to decide what to do next. The motel owner, a gruff but seemingly kind older woman named Martha, gave me a room at the back, overlooking the woods. I spent the rest of the day holed up inside, reviewing the photos on my laptop. The more I looked at them, the more unsettling they became. There was a distinct intelligence in the creature's eyes, a knowing look that made me feel like I had stumbled upon something I wasn't supposed to see. I tried searching online for any information about strange creatures in Newfoundland, any local legends or folklore that might offer some explanation. I found plenty of stories about moose, bears, and the occasional lynx sighting, but nothing that even remotely resembled the animal I had photographed. There were some old tales about mythical creatures said to inhabit the remote forests, but they were dismissed as just that, myths. But what I had seen was real. The photos were proof of that, and the fear I had felt in that moment in the woods was more real than anything I had ever experienced. As darkness fell, the motel room felt less like a sanctuary and more like a cage. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle outside the window made me jump. I kept the lights on and the curtains drawn, feeling a desperate need for human contact, for someone to tell me that what I had seen was just a figment of my imagination. The next morning, I decided I couldn't stay cooped up in the motel any longer. I needed to go back to try and understand what I had encountered. But I knew I couldn't go alone. I needed help, someone who knew the area, someone who could perhaps identify the creature or at least offer some explanation. I drove to the nearest town, a small fishing community nestled along the coast. I stopped at the local diner, a cozy place filled with the aroma of strong coffee and fried food. I sat at the counter and ordered breakfast, trying to look like a normal tourist while my mind raced with thoughts of the creature. As I ate, I overheard two elderly fishermen talking at a nearby table. They were discussing strange happenings in the woods, whispers of unusual animal sightings, and livestock occasionally going missing from remote farms. They spoke in hushed tones, their words carrying an air of superstition and fear. I cautiously approached their table and introduced myself. I told them I was a wildlife photographer who had been exploring the inland forests. I hesitated for a moment, unsure how much to reveal, then decided to take a chance. "I think I saw something unusual out in the woods," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Something I've never seen before." The two men exchanged a knowing look. The older of the two, a weathered man with eyes as deep and blue as the ocean, leaned closer. "What did you see, son?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. I pulled out my laptop and showed them the photographs. Their expressions shifted from mild curiosity to stunned disbelief. They leaned in, their eyes wide as they examined the images. By the saints. The younger fisherman breathed, his voice filled with awe and a hint of terror. "What in God's name is that?" The older man, whose name was Elias, shook his head slowly. "I've heard tales, old stories whispered by the fire. Stories of something that roams these woods, something ancient. They call it, well, there are many names. Some say it's a Wendigo, others a Micmac spirit. But no one living has ever seen it, not truly. Wendigo. The name sent a chill down my spine. I had heard of the legend, the cannibalistic creature of Algonquian folklore, a malevolent spirit associated with winter, famine, and greed. Could that be what I had seen? It seemed too fantastical, too unreal. "But it can't be," I stammered. "That's just a legend, right?" Elias looked at me, his eyes filled with a deep sadness. "Legends often have a grain of truth, son, especially in a place as wild and old as this. There are things in these forests that science can't explain, things that have walked this land long before we ever set foot here." He told me stories he had heard growing up. Tales of strange howls in the night, of tracks that disappeared without a trace, of a feeling of being watched by unseen eyes. He spoke of hunters who had gone missing in the woods, their fates never to be known. The more Elias spoke, the more a sense of dread washed over me. I had stumbled into something far older and more mysterious than I could have ever imagined. My desire for the perfect photograph had led me down a path into the realm of the unknown, and I had a sinking feeling that I was in way over my head. The younger fisherman, whose name was Finn, chimed in, his voice trembling slightly. "You need to be careful, mister. If that thing is what the old stories say it is, well, it's not something you want to cross paths with again. They warned me to stay away from the deeper parts of the forest, to stick to the main roads, and to never travel alone. They spoke of an unnatural hunger, a malevolent intelligence, and a connection to the land that went beyond the understanding of modern man. I left the diner feeling more uneasy than ever. The encounter I had in the woods was no longer just a strange animal sighting. According to Elias and Finn, it could be something much more sinister, something woven into the very fabric of the land. I returned to my motel room, the photos on my laptop now carrying a weight of dread. The creature's eyes seemed to stare back at me, filled with an ancient wisdom and a chilling hunger. I knew I couldn't just leave. I had seen something extraordinary, something that defied explanation. The photographer in me, the explorer, felt compelled to learn more, to document this incredible discovery. But the fear was also there, gnawing at me, a constant reminder of the raw power and unsettling intelligence I had witnessed in those black eyes. I was caught between the thrill of the unknown and the primal fear of what lurked in the shadows of the Newfoundland wilderness. My adventure had taken a dark and unexpected turn, and I had a growing sense that the perfect shot might come at a terrifying price. Despite the warnings from Elias and Finn, I couldn't bring myself to leave Newfoundland. The images on my laptop were a constant reminder of what I had seen, a mystery that begged to be solved. Fear warred with an insatiable curiosity, the kind that drives explorers and scientists to the ends of the earth. In the end, curiosity won. I decided to take a more cautious approach. I traded my small SUV for a more rugged pickup truck with four-wheel drive better suited for the rough terrain. I stocked up on more supplies, including extra food, water, and safety equipment. I also invested in a trail camera, hoping to capture more evidence without putting myself directly in harm's way. For the next week, I focused on researching the area. I spent hours in local libraries and historical societies, poring over old maps and journals, searching for any mention of strange creatures or unusual sightings. I found some vague references to unexplained events in the early logging days, whispers of loggers disappearing in the woods, and strange tracks found near their camps. But nothing concrete. I revisited the area where I had first encountered the creature, but this time I stayed on the periphery, setting up the trail camera in a carefully chosen location, hoping it would capture something without alerting whatever was out there. I checked the camera every few days, but it only captured the usual wildlife: deer, foxes, and a few curious birds. Days turned into weeks, and the initial fear began to subside, replaced by a growing sense of frustration. Had I imagined the whole thing? Was it just some kind of known animal that I had misidentified in a moment of panic? Doubts started to creep into my mind. Then, one morning, when I went to check the trail camera, I found something. The camera had been knocked off its mounting, lying face down in the mud. My heart sank. Had the creature found it? Had it been destroyed? I carefully picked up the camera and wiped off the mud. The lens was cracked, but the memory card was intact. Back at my motel room, I anxiously plugged the card into my laptop and began to review the footage. Most of the images were blurry and distorted due to the camera being knocked over. But then, I found it. A series of images taken just before the camera was dislodged that sent a fresh wave of terror through me. There it was, the creature, standing directly in front of the camera. The cracked lens distorted its features slightly, but the details were still horrifyingly clear. Its dark fur, its powerful frame, the wide, unsettling mouth filled with sharp teeth, and those eyes, those intelligent, black eyes that seemed to pierce right through the lens, right through me. But there was something else in these images, something I hadn't noticed before. In one of the last clear frames, the creature was holding something in its long, sinuous hand. Something familiar. I zoomed in on the image, my breath catching in my throat. It was my camera, my expensive telephoto lens camera that I had been carrying the day I first saw it. The camera I had thought I had securely strapped to my backpack. How? When? I had no recollection of losing it. Had it somehow managed to take it from me without me noticing? The thought was deeply unsettling. I felt a sudden urge to leave, to pack up everything and drive away from this cursed island as fast as I could. But the image of my camera in that creature's hand held me captive. It was more than just an expensive piece of equipment. It was a symbol of my encounter, a tangible link to the unknown. I knew I had to go back. I had to try and retrieve my camera. It was a foolish, irrational decision, driven more by a strange sense of obligation and perhaps a touch of morbid fascination than by any logical reasoning. I spent the next few days preparing. I studied the terrain around where I had set up the trail camera, looking for any signs of the creature's presence. I packed light, carrying only the essentials: a compass, a map, a knife, some food and water, and a smaller, more discreet camera. I also made sure to bring the bear spray, though I had a growing feeling that it would be woefully inadequate against whatever I was about to face. On a cold, overcast morning, I set out. The forest was silent, the air heavy with the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves. I moved slowly and deliberately, my senses on high alert, listening for any sound, watching for any movement. I reached the spot where I had placed the trail camera. The ground was still disturbed, and I could see faint tracks leading deeper into the woods. My heart pounded in my chest. It had been here. Recently. I hesitated for a moment, the warnings of Elias and Finn echoing in my mind. But the pull of the unknown, the need to understand what I had seen, was too strong to resist. I took a deep breath and followed the tracks. The trail led me through increasingly dense forest, the trees growing taller and thicker, blocking out most of the sunlight. The air grew colder, and a sense of unease settled over me. I felt like I was entering a place that was not meant for human eyes. After what felt like hours, I came to a small clearing. In the center of the clearing was a crude structure made of branches and mud, almost like a large nest. And there, lying on the ground near the structure, was my camera. It looked undamaged, except for a few scratches on the lens. I cautiously approached it, my eyes scanning the surrounding woods for any sign of the creature. The clearing was silent, eerily so. I reached down and picked up my camera. As I did, I noticed something else nearby. Partially buried in the mud was a small, leather-bound journal. It looked old, worn, its pages swollen with moisture. Intrigued, I picked it up and carefully brushed away the mud. The cover was blank, but the aged leather felt strangely familiar. I opened it, my fingers trembling slightly. The pages were filled with handwriting, faded and difficult to read, but unmistakably English. As I deciphered the words, a horrifying story began to unfold. The journal belonged to a man who had come to this region many years ago, also a photographer, drawn by the promise of capturing the beauty of the Newfoundland wilderness. His early entries were filled with excitement and wonder, describing the stunning landscapes and the abundant wildlife. But as the weeks passed, a sense of unease began to creep into his writing. He wrote of strange tracks, of unsettling howls in the night, and of a persistent feeling of being watched. Then, the tone of the journal shifted. The entries became shorter, more frantic, filled with fear and paranoia. He wrote of fleeting glimpses of a dark figure in the woods, of livestock disappearing from nearby farms, and of a growing sense that he was being hunted. The last few entries were barely legible, scrawled in a desperate hand. He described being stalked, of hearing whispers in the wind, and of a growing conviction that something ancient and evil was watching him. The final entry simply read, "It's in the trees, its eyes." A cold dread washed over me as I read the last words. The journal mirrored my own experience, the same initial wonder giving way to the same terrifying realization of a presence that defied explanation. Just then, I heard a sound, a low growl, coming from the edge of the clearing. My blood ran cold. I looked up, and there it was. The creature emerged from the trees, its dark eyes fixed on me. It was even larger than I remembered, its powerful muscles rippling beneath its dark fur. It held my trail camera in one hand, dangling it carelessly, while in the other, I now saw, was another object, a tattered, leather-bound journal, identical to the one I held in my own hand. Recognition dawned on me. This wasn't the first photographer to stumble upon this creature's domain. It had happened before. And the ending, if the journal was any indication, was far from happy. The creature took a step closer, the growl deepening into a guttural snarl. Its wide mouth opened, revealing rows of razor-sharp teeth. There was no mistaking the hunger in its eyes, the predatory intelligence that radiated from it. I stood frozen, my own camera clutched in my hand, the journal falling to the muddy ground. My fear was so intense it was paralyzing. I had sought to capture the unknown, and now the unknown had found me. The creature took another step, and I knew this was it. There would be no reasoning with it, no escape. My final thought, as those black eyes bore down on me, was of the images on my laptop, the captured proof of its existence. Would anyone ever find them? Would anyone ever believe what I had seen? The last thing I heard was a deafening roar, followed by a searing pain, and then nothing but silence. The camera, still clutched in my lifeless hand, lay discarded on the forest floor, its lens pointed towards a darkening canopy, forever recording the secrets of the Newfoundland wilderness. My name is Jessica, and I'm writing this down well. I'm trying to anyway. The battery on this old satellite phone is flickering, and I don't know how much longer it'll last. Maybe this will never even be read. Maybe it'll just be another ghost in the digital ether. But I have to try. Someone needs to know what happened up here. What's happening? It started like any other expedition, I guess. We were a tight-knit group, the kind of people who felt more at home thousands of feet above sea level than in their own living rooms. There was Mark, our seasoned leader, always calm and collected, even when the weather turned nasty. Then there was Ben, the jokester, the one who could always crack a smile even when we were shivering in our tents after a grueling day. And me, well, I was the pragmatic one, the planner, the one who checked the gear, and made sure we had enough rations. We'd climbed together for years, tackled peaks all over the world, the Andes, the Himalayas, even a terrifying ascent in the Karakoram. We thought we'd seen it all. We were wrong. So wrong. This time, our target was a remote, unnamed peak deep in the Yukon Territory. It wasn't the tallest, not by a long shot, but it was notoriously challenging. Jagged, unpredictable weather, treacherous ice falls, and a summit that had only been reached a handful of times in recorded history. That's what drew us to it. The challenge. The allure of conquering something truly wild, something untamed. We flew into a small outpost town. a collection of hardy souls who seemed unfazed by the sheer vastness of the wilderness surrounding them. They gave us curt nods and knowing glances as we loaded our supplies onto a battered old bush plane. I remember one of the locals, an old woman with eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of the mountains themselves, looking at us with a strange mixture of pity and fear. "That mountain?" she'd rasped, her voice like dry leaves skittering across the ground. "It doesn't like to be bothered." We just chuckled, attributing it to local folklore. Now, I wish we had listened. The flight in was breathtaking, a tapestry of endless pine forests, glacial rivers carving their way through the landscape, and finally the majestic, snow-capped peaks rising in the distance like the teeth of some slumbering giant. Our peak stood out amongst them, its silhouette sharp and unforgiving against the pale Arctic sky. As the plane banked for its return journey, leaving us with our supplies in the middle of nowhere, a profound sense of isolation settled over us. It was a familiar feeling, one we usually embraced. This time, however, there was an undercurrent of something else, something unsettling. The first few days were tough, as expected. The lower slopes were a brutal mix of dense forest and steep, rocky terrain. The air was crisp and cold, biting at our exposed skin despite the layers of thermal gear. We established our base camp near a glacial stream, the water icy but pure. Mark was meticulous setting up our tents, checking the weather forecast on his satellite device, and organizing our climbing schedule. Ben, ever the optimist, kept our spirits up with his endless supply of bad jokes and surprisingly good camp cooking. As we ascended, the landscape began to change dramatically. The trees thinned out, replaced by barren, windswept slopes of scree and ice. The wind howled like a banshee, threatening to rip us from our holds. We moved slowly, carefully, our ice axes biting into the frozen ground, our crampons finding purchase on the treacherous ice. The silence up there was immense, broken only by the rhythmic crunch of our boots and the whistling wind. It was a silence that felt heavy, pregnant with something unseen. It was on our third day above base camp, as we were navigating a particularly tricky ice fall, that things started to feel off. It wasn't anything specific at first, just a series of small, almost imperceptible things that chipped away at the sense of normalcy. A strange echo that didn't quite match our voices. A fleeting shadow in our peripheral vision when there should have been nothing there. A feeling of being watched. Even though we were miles from civilization, I remember stopping to catch my breath, the thin air burning in my lungs, and looking out at the vast expanse of the Yukon wilderness stretching out below us. It was beautiful undeniably, but there was also a sense of something ancient and immense, something that had been here long before us and would remain long after we were gone. It felt indifferent to our presence, even hostile. Later that day, as we set up our high camp in a small snow cave we'd painstakingly carved out, Ben swore he heard something. It was a low, guttural sound like a growl, but wrong somehow. Deeper, more resonant than any animal he'd ever heard. Mark dismissed it as the wind playing tricks, but Ben was visibly shaken. He kept glancing nervously at the entrance of the cave, his usual jovial demeanor replaced by a quiet unease. That night, sleep didn't come easily. The wind howled outside, rattling the entrance of our snow cave. I kept hearing faint scratching noises, just beyond the thin layer of packed snow, like something was trying to dig its way in. I told myself it was just the ice crystals shifting, the wind picking up small stones. But a prickle of fear, cold and sharp, began to take root in my chest. The next morning, the weather took a turn for the worse. A blizzard rolled in with terrifying speed, the snow falling thick and fast, reducing visibility to near zero. Mark made the call to stay put, hunkered down in our snow cave until the storm passed. The hours crawled by, filled with the monotonous roar of the wind and the suffocating closeness of our small shelter. It was during the height of the storm that we found the first sign that something was terribly wrong. Ben, who was closest to the entrance, suddenly gasped. "Guys," he whispered, his voice trembling, "look at this." We crawled over to where he was pointing. Partially buried in the snow just outside the entrance to our cave was a footprint. It was huge, easily twice the size of Mark's boot print, and wrong. It wasn't quite human, nor did it resemble any animal track any of us had ever seen. It was vaguely humanoid in shape, but the toes were too long, too spindly, and the heel was strangely elongated. The more we looked at it, the more unsettling it became. It looked ancient primal, like something that shouldn't exist. Mark tried to remain rational, suggesting it might be a very large wolf or some other unknown creature, but his voice lacked conviction. We all knew deep down that whatever had made that print was not of this world. The feeling of being watched intensified, morphing into a palpable sense of dread. We were no longer just climbing a challenging peak. We had stumbled upon something else entirely, something ancient and malevolent that called these mountains home, and I had a terrifying feeling that it was now aware of us. This is Jessica, signing off for now. The satellite phone battery is getting low. I don't know what we'll do, but I needed to record this much. I hope someone finds it, I really do. The blizzard raged for what felt like an eternity. Trapped in our cramped snow cave, the discovery of the footprint hung heavy in the air, thicker than the swirling snow outside. We tried to rationalize it, throwing out theories. Maybe it was a bear, mutated or unusually large. Maybe it was some kind of hoax, though the thought seemed ludicrous given our remote location. But the unease in our hearts wouldn't dissipate. The print was too alien. When the storm finally abated, after nearly 2 days of relentless whiteout, the world outside was transformed. A thick blanket of fresh snow covered everything, the landscape looking both pristine and strangely menacing. The footprint, however, was mostly gone, filled in by the drifting snow. Only a faint, distorted impression remained, just enough to remind us that we hadn't imagined it. Mark, ever the pragmatist, insisted we needed to continue our ascent if the weather held. Staying put any longer would deplete our supplies and increase the risk of being caught in another storm. Ben, though still visibly unnerved, nodded in agreement. I was the most reluctant. A gnawing feeling of foreboding had settled deep within me, a sense that we were treading on ground that was not meant for us. But I kept my concerns to myself. We had come this far. Turning back now felt like admitting defeat. We broke camp, the silence after the storm amplifying every sound, the crunch of our boots on the fresh snow, the clink of our carabiners, our own ragged breaths in the thin, cold air. The higher we climbed, the more desolate the landscape became. The last vestiges of vegetation disappeared, replaced by a stark expanse of rock ice and snow. The wind, though not as fierce as during the blizzard, still howled with an almost mournful tone, like the mountain itself was lamenting our intrusion. It was during a particularly exposed traverse, clinging to a narrow ice ridge with a sheer drop on either side, that we encountered the next sign. Mark, who was leading, suddenly stopped, his ice axe held aloft. "What is it?" Ben called out, his voice tight with anxiety. "Look," Mark said, pointing with the tip of his axe. Below us, etched into the rock face, were carvings. They were unlike anything I had ever seen, not the crude markings of past climbers, nor the familiar symbols of any known culture. These were intricate, almost geometric patterns, spirals intertwined with angular lines depicting strange, elongated figures with multiple limbs and unsettlingly large eyes. The rock they were carved into looked ancient, weathered by centuries, perhaps millennia, of exposure to the elements. We spent a long time examining them, our initial fear giving way to a sense of morbid fascination. They seemed to emanate a strange energy, a feeling of immense age and power. It was as if the mountain itself was whispering secrets from a time long forgotten. "What do you think they are?" Ben asked, his voice hushed. Mark shook his head. "I have no idea. I've read accounts of strange markings found in remote mountain regions, attributed to unknown indigenous tribes, but these feel different." I felt a shiver run down my spine, despite the layers of clothing I was wearing. These carvings didn't feel like the work of any human hand. They felt older, more primal. They reinforced the growing sense that this mountain was not just a geological formation, but something else entirely, something with a history that stretched back beyond our comprehension. As we continued our ascent, the carvings became more frequent, appearing on rocks, in shallow caves, even etched into the ice. They seemed to guide us upwards, leading us deeper into the mountain's embrace. With each new discovery, the sense of dread intensified. We were no longer just exploring a remote wilderness. We were following a trail left by something unknown, something potentially dangerous. The air grew colder, thinner. The sun, when it managed to pierce through the clouds, cast long, eerie shadows that danced and wreathed on the snow-covered slopes. We were nearing the summit, the final, most challenging part of our climb. The rock here was treacherous, loose and brittle, and the exposure was terrifying. It was Ben who found the next thing. He was a little ahead of Mark and me, scouting a route through a particularly complex section of ice. Suddenly, he let out a shout, a sound of pure, unadulterated terror. We scrambled towards him, our hearts pounding in our chests. Ben was standing frozen, staring at something embedded in the ice. It was a skull. Not a human skull, It was far too large, its features grotesque and alien. The eye sockets were enormous and deep, and the jaw was filled with rows upon rows of razor-sharp teeth. Protruding from the top of the skull were two long, curved horns like those of some mythical beast. The sight of it sent a wave of nausea washing over me. This was no animal skull. This was something monstrous, something that shouldn't exist. Mark, though clearly shaken, tried to maintain his composure. Maybe it's a fossil, he suggested, his voice wavering slightly. Some kind of prehistoric creature. But we all knew he didn't believe it. This skull felt too recent, too intact. It was as if it had been entombed in the ice relatively recently. The discovery of the skull shattered any remaining semblance of normalcy. The unsettling feelings, the strange noises, the bizarre carvings, they all coalesced into a terrifying picture. This mountain was not just remote and challenging, it was haunted, guarded by something ancient and monstrous. Despite the overwhelming fear, a morbid curiosity compelled us to continue. We had to know what awaited us at the summit, what secrets this terrifying place held. As we finally reached the summit, after what felt like an eternity of grueling climbing, we were met not with the breathtaking panoramic views we had anticipated, but with a dense, swirling fog. It was eerily silent up there, the wind seemingly holding its breath. We could barely see a few feet in front of us. "Hello," Mark called out, his voice swallowed by the fog. Only silence answered. We huddled together, our senses on high alert, scanning the swirling mist for any sign of what lay ahead. And then we heard it. A low, guttural growl, closer this time. Much closer. It seemed to emanate from the fog itself, a sound that resonated deep within our bones, chilling us to our very core. Then the fog began to thin slowly, revealing a horrifying sight. Standing before us on the narrow, snow-covered summit was a creature unlike anything any of us had ever imagined. It was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs long and spindly, like those in the carvings we had seen. Its skin was a sickly gray, stretched taut over what looked like bone, and its eyes were enormous black and filled with an ancient, malevolent intelligence that seemed to pierce right through us. The horns on its head were even larger and more menacing than those on the skull we had found. It let out another growl, a sound that was less animalistic and more like the grinding of stones, the death rattle of the earth itself. It took a step towards us, its long, clawed feet sinking slightly into the snow. We were frozen in terror, our climbing gear suddenly feeling woefully inadequate against this primeval horror. Mark, to his credit, was the first to react. He yelled a primal scream of fear and defiance and raised his ice axe. The creature didn't even flinch. It simply tilted its massive head, those black eyes fixing on Mark with an unnerving intensity. And then it moved with a speed that defied its size, lunging towards him. This is Jessica again. The battery is still holding, barely. I don't know how much time I have left. What happened next, it was a nightmare. I can barely bring myself to write it down. But I have to try for Mark, for Ben, for anyone who might stumble upon this cursed place. Mark's ice axe struck the creature's side with a sickening thud, but it was like hitting solid rock. The creature barely registered the blow, its black eyes still fixed on him. Then, with a swiftness that belied its size, it swiped a long, clawed hand, and Mark was thrown back, skidding across the snow, a horrifying gash opening across his chest. He didn't move. Ben and I reacted instantly, scrambling back, our minds reeling in terror. The creature turned its gaze towards Ben, and Ben, to his eternal credit, stood his ground. He fumbled with the knife on his belt, a pathetic gesture against such a monstrous foe, but it was all he had. Before Ben could even raise the knife, the creature lunged again, its movements fluid and terrifyingly graceful. There was a sickening crunch and Ben collapsed, his body twisted at an unnatural angle. His eyes stared up at the swirling fog, vacant and lifeless. I was alone. Utterly, terrifyingly alone. My breath hitched in my throat, my legs felt like lead. I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything but stand there and face this unimaginable horror. But I couldn't move. I was paralyzed by fear. The creature turned its attention to me. It took slow, deliberate steps, its massive form looming over me. I could smell its breath, a foul, ancient odor like ozone and decay. Its black eyes seemed to peer into my very soul, stripping away all pretense of courage, leaving me bare and vulnerable. It reached out a long skeletal finger, the nail like a shard of obsidian. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing for the inevitable. But the touch never came. Instead, I felt a strange pressure against my forehead, a cold, probing sensation. It felt like an examination, as if this ancient entity was trying to understand me, to decipher the very essence of my being. Then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The pressure lifted. I slowly opened my eyes, half expecting to see its hideous face inches from mine, but it had stepped back, its head tilted slightly, as if in contemplation. It let out a sound then, not a growl this time, but something else entirely, a low, resonant hum that vibrated through the very air around me. It was a sound that spoke of ages past, of forgotten rituals and unspeakable power. And somehow, impossibly, I understood it. It wasn't words, not in any language I knew, but the feeling, the intent was clear. This place was sacred. We had trespassed. We were not welcome. Then it gestured with one of its long limbs towards something behind me, something I hadn't noticed in the fog. It was a narrow passage, a dark opening in the rock face that seemed to lead downwards into the heart of the mountain. The creature made another sound, a softer hum this time, almost a whisper. And again, I understood. It was offering me a way out, a chance to leave this place, to take its secrets with me, but never to return. My mind was a whirlwind of terror and disbelief. Why was it letting me live? Why not just kill me like it had Mark and Ben? Was this some kind of cruel game, or was it truly offering me a reprieve? I didn't hesitate. I turned and stumbled towards the passage, my legs shaking so badly I could barely stand. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The image of Mark and Ben lying lifeless in the snow was burned into my mind. The passage was dark and narrow, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and something else, something ancient and mineral. I fumbled for my headlamp, my hands trembling so violently I could barely operate it. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing a steep, winding descent. I don't know how long I've been down here. Hours, maybe days. Time seems to have lost all meaning. The passage eventually opened into a vast cavern, the ceiling lost in shadow. I can hear the distant sound of rushing water, and the air is heavy with moisture. I found this small alcove, a relatively dry spot where I could rest and try to write this down. The satellite phone is flickering, the battery almost dead. I don't know if I'll ever make it out of this mountain. The passage behind me is too dark, too treacherous to climb back up, and I have no idea what lies further down. But I had to tell someone. I had to record what happened here, the horror we unleashed by our arrogance, our desire to conquer the unconquerable. This mountain is not meant to be climbed. It is a guardian, a sentinel, protecting something ancient and powerful from the prying eyes of the world. If anyone ever finds this, please, heed my warning. Stay away from this place. Leave the secrets of the Yukon wilderness undisturbed. Some doors are best left unopened. Some mountains are best left unclimbed. The light on the phone is fading. I can hear a faint scratching sound in the distance. Maybe it's just the wind, or maybe it's coming back for me. This is Jessica. My name is Jessica, and the recording ends abruptly. My name is Kevin, and I've always been drawn to the quiet corners of the world, the places where the pavement ends and the real earth begins. Maybe it's a touch of romanticism, or maybe it's just a craving for solitude. But the wilder, the more untamed, the better as far as I'm concerned. That's probably why, on a whim and a healthy dose of what I now recognize as foolish impulsiveness, I decided to tackle a less traveled section of the Trans-Canada Trail. I'd spent weeks poring over maps highlighting potential routes. The main arteries of the trail, the ones closer to towns and amenities, held no appeal for me. I wanted the deep woods, the kind of silence that swallows sound, the kind of scenery that hasn't been Instagrammed a million times. Eventually, I settled on a stretch in northern Ontario, a section that the online forums described as challenging and lightly used. Those were the magic words. Challenging meant fewer people, and lightly used meant the wilderness would likely feel more profound, more untouched. The drive up was beautiful, a tapestry of late summer colors as the leaves began their slow transition from vibrant green to the golds and reds of autumn. The air grew crisper the further north I went, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. I felt a familiar thrill of anticipation, the kind that always precedes a solo adventure into the backcountry. I packed meticulously, ensuring I had enough food, water, and the necessary gear for a few days on my own. My backpack felt reassuringly heavy, a tangible representation of my self-reliance. The trailhead was exactly as described at a small, unassuming clearing just off a logging road. There was no grand archway or visitor center, just a weathered wooden sign with the faded words, Trans-Canada Trail, barely visible beneath layers of moss and lichen. A single, rusted pickup truck was parked haphazardly in the clearing, its flat tires and overgrown weeds suggesting it had been there for a long, long time. It added a touch of forgotten history to the scene, a silent testament to the trail's more remote nature. I shouldered my pack, took a deep breath of the clean, pine-scented air, and started down the path. The first few hours were exactly what I'd hoped for. The trail was narrow, winding through dense forest where sunlight filtered through the canopy in dappled patterns. The only sounds were the crunch of my boots on the fallen leaves, the occasional chirping of unseen birds, and the whisper of the wind through the trees. It was peaceful, serene, exactly the escape I'd been craving. The trail climbed gradually, and after a couple of hours, I reached a small ridge that offered a panoramic view of the surrounding wilderness. A seemingly endless expanse of trees stretched out before me, a sea of green and gold under a vast blue sky. In the distance, I could see the faint shimmer of a lake, its surface undisturbed by any sign of human activity. I stopped for a while, savoring the view and the feeling of being utterly alone in this immense landscape. As the afternoon wore on, the trail began to change. It became less distinct, overgrown in places with ferns and thick underbrush. I had to pay closer attention to the faint markers, nailed to trees to ensure I was still on the right path. The forest also seemed to grow darker, the trees taller and closer together, blocking out more of the sunlight. The air became heavier, still and humid, and the cheerful birdsong of the morning had faded into an unnerving silence. It was around this time that I started to notice things. Subtle at first, almost easily dismissed as tricks of the light or the rustling of small animals. A fleeting glimpse of movement in the periphery of my vision, a sound that might have been a twig snapping in the distance. Individually, they meant nothing, but as they accumulated, a sense of unease began to creep into the edges of my awareness. I told myself it was just my imagination, the heightened senses that come with being alone in the wilderness. My mind was probably just filling in the blanks, conjuring up imagined threats in the silence. But the feeling persisted, a prickling sensation on the back of my neck that told me I was being watched. Then came the first truly unsettling discovery. I rounded a bend in the trail and saw it a single, child's boot lying in the middle of the path. It was small, perhaps a size 7 or 8, made of worn leather and covered in mud. It looked old, like it had been there for a long time. My heart skipped a beat. What was a child's boot doing in the middle of this remote trail? Had a child gotten lost here? The thought sent a shiver down my spine. I looked around, scanning the surrounding woods for any other signs of human presence, any indication of a campsite or a lost individual. There was nothing. Just the dense, silent forest. I picked up the boot, its leather stiff and cracked. It felt strangely heavy for its size. There was no sock inside, just a dark, matted substance that I didn't want to examine too closely. I placed the boot back on the trail, exactly where I had found it. It felt wrong to move it, like disturbing some kind of silent, unsettling tableau. I continued walking, my pace quickening, my eyes darting nervously around me. The peace of the morning had completely vanished, replaced by a gnawing feeling of dread. The sun began to dip below the trees, casting long, distorted shadows that danced and flickered in my peripheral vision. The forest grew darker still, and the silence seemed to deepen, pressing in on me from all sides. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. I kept expecting to see something, some explanation for the boot, for the growing sense of wrongness that permeated the air. As twilight descended, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, I stumbled upon another strange object. This time it was a small, wooden doll lying face down in the dirt. It was crudely made, with painted eyes that stared blankly into the ground. One of its arms was missing, and its clothes were torn and faded. It looked like something a child might have cherished, and then lost or abandoned. The sight of the doll was far more disturbing than the boot. The boot could have been an accident, something that fell off and was forgotten. But the doll felt intentional, placed there for some unknown purpose. It exuded a palpable sense of sadness, of something lost and forlorn. I didn't touch it, just stared at it for a long moment, my mind racing with unsettling possibilities. I decided I needed to find a place to camp for the night. The thought of spending the night in the growing darkness, surrounded by whatever was leaving these strange objects on the trail, was deeply unsettling. I scanned the area for a suitable spot, eventually finding a small clearing near a stream. It wasn't ideal, but it offered a relatively open space, and the sound of running water was at least a little comforting. As I started to set up my tent, the last vestiges of daylight faded from the sky. The forest was now shrouded in darkness, the only light coming from my headlamp. The beam danced nervously across the trees, illuminating patches of the trail and the surrounding undergrowth. Every shadow seemed to hold a potential threat. Every sound made me jump. I ate a quick, cold dinner, my appetite having completely vanished. The silence of the night was broken only by the chirping of crickets and the gentle murmur of the stream. But beneath those natural sounds, I thought I could hear something else, a faint, almost imperceptible rustling in the woods, just beyond the reach of my headlamp. I told myself it was just animals, deer or raccoons going about their nocturnal business, but the feeling of being watched intensified, becoming almost unbearable. I kept glancing into the darkness, half expecting to see a pair of eyes staring back at me. Finally, with a sense of profound unease, I crawled into my tent, zipped it shut, and lay down in my sleeping bag. The thin nylon offered little in the way of comfort or security, but it was better than nothing. I kept my headlamp on, its beam illuminating the inside of the tent. I listened intently to the sounds of the night, every nerve in my body on high alert. Sleep didn't come easily. My mind was filled with images of the boot and the doll, their presence in this remote place feeling increasingly sinister. What were they? Who had left them there? And more importantly, why? As the hours crawled by, the rustling sounds outside my tent continued, sometimes closer, sometimes further away. Once I thought I heard a soft whimpering sound, like a child crying in the distance. But then it was gone, swallowed by the silence of the forest. I eventually drifted into a fitful sleep, haunted by unsettling dreams of dark woods and forgotten toys. When I finally woke up, the first rays of dawn were filtering through the trees. I sat up, my body stiff and aching, and peered out of the tent. Everything looked normal. The forest was bathed in the soft, golden light of morning, the air filled with the cheerful song of birds. Had it all been just my imagination? The unease, the feeling of being watched, the disturbing thoughts that had plagued me through the night. I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, my eyes scanning the clearing, and that's when I saw it. Leaning against a nearby tree, just a few feet from my tent, was another object. This one was different from the boot and the doll. This one was a small hand-carved wooden figure. It was roughly humanoid in shape, with 2 arms, 2 legs, and a head. But its features were grotesquely exaggerated. Its eyes were wide and staring, its mouth stretched into a silent, screaming grin, and clutched in its tiny wooden hand was a single strands of what looked like human hair. My blood ran cold. This wasn't just a lost toy. This was something else entirely. And in that moment, standing in the quiet morning light of the Canadian wilderness, I knew I had made a terrible mistake venturing onto this less traveled section of the Trans-Canada Trail. My peaceful escape had just turned into something far more sinister. The small wooden figure was undeniably the most disturbing thing I had encountered so far. The crudeness of its carving only amplified its unsettling nature. The wide, staring eyes seemed to follow me, even when I tried to look away. The silent scream etched into its wooden face was deeply unsettling, and the strands of hair clutched in its hand sent a wave of nausea through me. Human hair, how could that be? And why was it holding it? I cautiously approached the figure, my heart pounding in my chest. I hesitated for a moment, then reached out and gently took the figure from the tree. It was surprisingly light, almost weightless. The wood felt rough and unfinished beneath my fingertips. I examined the hair more closely. It was dark, almost black, and appeared to be several strands woven together. It didn't look like it had been cut cleanly. Rather, it seemed torn or pulled out. The thought made my stomach churn. What was this thing? Some kind of macabre offering? A warning? Or just a creepy coincidence? The rational part of my brain tried to find logical explanations. Maybe a local artisan made these figures and left them around for some reason. Maybe a child had lost them. But the boot, the doll, and now this grotesque carving, it felt like more than just random occurrences. There was a pattern here, a disturbing narrative being woven in the silence of the woods. I decided I couldn't stay here any longer. Whatever was going on, I didn't want to be a part of it. My peaceful solo hike had taken a dark and unexpected turn. I needed to get back to my car, back to civilization, back to a place where unsettling wooden figures didn't mysteriously appear outside my tent in the middle of the night. I quickly packed up my campsite, my movements jerky and hurried. I felt a sense of urgency, a desperate need to put as much distance as possible between myself and this place. I stuffed my sleeping bag into its sack, rolled up my tent, and crammed everything back into my backpack without bothering to be neat or organized. My hands trembled slightly as I worked, my eyes constantly scanning the surrounding trees, half expecting to see something or someone watching me. With my pack feeling heavier and more cumbersome than before, I started back down the trail. I moved at a brisk pace, my boots pounding against the dirt and leaves. The cheerful birdsong of the early morning now sounded almost mocking, a stark contrast to the fear that gripped me. As I walked, I kept thinking about the figure. Should I have left it there? Should I have taken it with me? I ultimately decided against keeping it. There was something inherently wrong about it, something that made me want to get rid of it, to sever any connection I had to it. I found a sturdy branch and used it to nudge the figure off the trail and into the dense undergrowth. I didn't watch to see where it landed. The walk back felt longer and more arduous than the hike in. Every shadow seemed deeper, every sound more ominous. My imagination ran wild, conjuring up all sorts of terrifying scenarios. What if whoever had left these objects was still out here? What if they were watching me right now, hidden among the trees? I tried to focus on the trail, on putting one foot in front of the other. I tried to block out the fear and the unsettling images that kept flashing through my mind. But it was difficult. The silence of the woods, which had once been so appealing, now felt heavy and suffocating. After what felt like an eternity, I reached the point where the trail had started to become less distinct the day before. I remembered the feeling of unease that had begun to creep in around that time. Now, that feeling was a full-blown sense of panic. And then I saw it lying in the middle of the trail. Right where I had left it the previous day was the child's boot. My heart leaped into my throat. How? I was sure I had walked past this spot on my way deeper into the woods. Had I somehow missed it, or had someone or something placed it back there? I approached it cautiously, my eyes darting around, searching for any sign of movement. The boot looked exactly as I remembered it, its worn leather and muddy exterior strangely familiar. I didn't want to touch it again, but the sight of it sent a fresh wave of fear through me. It was as if whatever was out here was toying with me, leaving these disturbing breadcrumbs along the trail. I stepped over the boot, careful not to touch it, and continued on my way. My pace quickened, bordering on a run. I just wanted to get out of the woods, to escape this feeling of being watched and manipulated. A little further down the trail, I came across another unsettling sight. This time, it was the wooden doll, lying face down in the dirt exactly where I had seen it yesterday. It was as if no time had passed, as if the woods were stuck in some kind of horrifying loop. The sight of the doll, so innocuous on its own, now filled me with a sense of dread. It was no longer just a lost toy. It was a sign, a message, and I didn't like what it was saying. It felt like I was being followed, that my every step was being watched and anticipated. I didn't stop this time. I just kept walking, my gaze fixed on the trail ahead. I tried to ignore the growing sense of paranoia that was threatening to overwhelm me. But it was hard. The silence of the woods seemed to press in on me, filled with unspoken threats and unseen eyes. As I continued my frantic retreat, the trail seemed to twist and turn endlessly, leading me deeper and deeper into the oppressive forest. It felt like I was going in circles, that no matter how fast I walked, I wasn't getting any closer to the trailhead. Panic began to set in. My breath came in ragged gasps, and my legs ached with exhaustion. I stopped for a moment to catch my breath, leaning against a thick pine tree. The silence of the woods was broken only by the sound of my own heavy breathing. And then I heard it, a faint sound in the distance, a sound that made my blood run cold. It was a giggle, a child's giggle, high-pitched, innocent, and utterly terrifying in the context of everything that had happened. I froze, every muscle in my body tense. I listened intently, trying to pinpoint the direction of the sound. It seemed to come from somewhere deep in the woods, off to my right. The giggle came again, closer this time. It was followed by another, and then another, a series of childish giggles that echoed through the silent forest. They sounded innocent enough on their own, but after the boot, the doll, and the wooden figure, they took on a sinister quality. Who was giggling out here in the middle of nowhere? A lost child, or something else entirely. I started walking again, my pace hesitant this time. The giggling continued, sometimes closer, sometimes further away, as if the source was moving through the trees. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, the stress and fear playing tricks on my mind. But the sound was too real, too distinct to be imagined. As I rounded a bend in the trail, I saw something through the trees. A flash of color, something bright against the muted greens and browns of the forest. I stopped and peered through the foliage, my heart pounding in my chest. And then I saw her. A little girl standing by the side of the trail. She couldn't have been more than 7 or 8 years old. She had long, dark hair that cascaded down her back, and she was wearing a bright yellow dress that seemed strangely out of place in the dim forest light. She was facing away from me, looking into the trees, and she was giggling, the same high-pitched, unsettling giggle that I had heard moments before. I hesitated, unsure of what to do. Should I call out to her? Was she lost? Was she the one who had left the boot and the doll? I took a step forward, intending to say something, but then she turned around. And that's when I regretted ever venturing onto this trail. Her face was pale and gaunt, her eyes wide and black, with no discernible pupils. They seemed to absorb the light, giving her an unnerving, lifeless appearance. And her mouth was stretched into a wide, unnatural smile, revealing rows upon rows of sharp, pointed teeth. The giggling stopped, replaced by a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from deep within her throat. Her head tilted slightly to one side, and her black eyes fixed on me with an unnerving intensity. In that moment, I knew that this was no ordinary child. This was something else, something unnatural, something that had no place in the familiar world. A primal fear surged through me, overriding any semblance of rational thought. I didn't think. I just reacted. I turned and ran, stumbling and scrambling back down the trail, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind me, I could hear the sound of her footsteps, light but impossibly fast, keeping pace with my own frantic flight. And then, the giggling started again, closer now, laced with a chilling, predatory edge. I didn't dare to look back. I just kept running, my lungs burning, my legs aching, driven by a terror more profound than anything I had ever experienced. The trees blurred past me, the trail a ribbon of dirt and leaves beneath my pounding feet. I could feel her presence behind me, just out of sight, the giggling a constant reminder of the unnatural thing that was pursuing me. I didn't know what it wanted, but I knew I didn't want to find out. The image of her pale face and those black, empty eyes was seared into my mind, a horrifying vision that propelled me forward. I ran as if my life depended on it, because in that moment, I knew it did. The less traveled section of the Trans-Canada Trail had revealed something truly disturbing, and I feared I would never escape its grasp. I ran blindly, not caring where the trail led, only knowing that I had to put as much distance as possible between myself and that thing. The woods became a blur of green and brown as I stumbled over roots and rocks, branches whipping at my face. My lungs burned. My muscles screamed in protest, but the image of that terrifying face kept me going. The giggling persisted behind me, sometimes close enough to send a shiver down my spine, sometimes fading into the distance only to return moments later. It was relentless mocking, a constant reminder of the unnatural horror that was pursuing me. I glanced back once, a foolish and almost fatal mistake. I saw her again, gliding through the trees with an unnatural speed, her yellow dress a flash of color against the dark foliage. Her head was still tilted at that unsettling angle, and that grotesque smile remained fixed on her face. But this time I saw something else. She was holding something in her hand. Something small and dark that I didn't want to recognize. I turned back and focused on the trail, pushing myself even harder. I had to reach my car. It was the only chance I had. I remembered the logging road, the rusted pickup truck. That was my goal. The trail seemed to stretch on endlessly, each twist and turn leading me deeper into the oppressive woods. The sunlight had long since been swallowed by the thick canopy, and the forest was now cast in a dim, eerie gloom. Every shadow seemed to conceal a threat. Every rustle of leaves made me jump. My legs felt like lead, and my breath came in ragged gasps. I could feel my strength fading, but the thought of what was behind me spurred me onward. I had to keep moving. Suddenly, the trees began to thin, and I saw a faint light ahead. Hope surged through me. Could it be the logging road? I pushed myself to run faster, my heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation. And then I burst out of the trees and into the clearing. There it was, the logging road stretching out before me like a ribbon of gravel. And there, parked haphazardly where I had left it, was my car. Relief washed over me in a dizzying wave. I had made it. I had escaped. But then I saw it. Standing beside my car, its bright yellow dress a stark contrast to the muted colors of the clearing, was the little girl. My blood ran cold. How had she gotten there so fast? It was impossible. She was just standing there, facing me, her head tilted, that horrifying smile still fixed on her face. In her hand, she held the small wooden figure, the one with the screaming grin and the strands of dark hair. The giggling started again, louder this time, echoing through the clearing. It was a sound that would forever be etched into my nightmares. I didn't hesitate. I fumbled for my keys, my hands shaking so badly that I could barely grip them. I unlocked the car, yanked the door open, and scrambled inside. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my eyes fixed on the little girl who was still standing there, watching me. I fumbled with the ignition, my heart pounding in my chest. The engine finally turned over, and I slammed the car into reverse, backing out of the clearing as fast as I could. I didn't take my eyes off the rearview mirror. The little girl was still there, her black eyes following my every move. As I reached the logging road, I put the car into drive and sped away, leaving the clearing and the horrifying figure behind me. I didn't stop, didn't slow down, until I was miles away from the trail. The image of that pale face and those black eyes burned into my memory. I eventually made it back to civilization, shaken and traumatized by what I had experienced. I went to the police, but how could I explain what I had seen? A creepy little girl with black eyes and sharp teeth who appeared and disappeared without explanation. They would think I was crazy. I tried to forget, to rationalize some kind of hallucination brought on by exhaustion and stress, but I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, heard her giggling. I never went back to that section of the Trans-Canada Trail. In fact, I never went hiking alone in the woods again. The quiet corners of the world had lost their appeal. The wilderness, once a source of peace and solace, had become a place of fear and dread. Weeks turned into months, and the vividness of the encounter began to fade, replaced by a dull ache of unease. I started to think maybe it had been a dream, a nightmare brought on by too much isolation. Then, one day I was cleaning out my car. In the back seat, tucked under a floor mat, I found something. It was small, hand-carved, made of rough wood. It had wide, staring eyes, a mouth stretched into a silent, screaming grin, and clutched in its tiny wooden hand was a single strand of dark, almost black hair. The giggling started again, echoing in my mind, and I knew that my nightmare was far from over. The less traveled section of the Trans-Canada Trail had given me a souvenir, a chilling reminder of the darkness that lurks in the quiet corners of the world, and it would follow me forever. My name is Megan, and for the past 5 years, my best friend has been a scruffy, medium-sized mutt I affectionately call Shadow. We live in a cozy little house nestled on the outskirts of a small town in Nova Scotia. Life here is generally peaceful, the kind of place where everyone knows your name, and the biggest excitement of the week is usually the Saturday morning farmer's market. But for me, the real charm of living here lies just beyond the town limits in the vast, sprawling forests that carpet much of this province. Shadow and I are inseparable, and our favorite thing to do, hands down, is to hike through those woods. It's our daily ritual, our way of unwinding and connecting with nature. Rain or shine, almost every afternoon, you'll find us venturing onto one of the numerous trails that wind through the towering pines and ancient maples. Shadow, with his boundless energy, always leads the way, his nose twitching, tail wagging furiously as he sniffs at every scent the forest floor offers. I usually follow at a more leisurely pace, taking in the sights, the sounds, the crisp, clean air. It's my therapy, my escape from the mundane. We have our favorite routes, trails that have become so familiar we could probably navigate them blindfolded. There's the winding path along the old brook, where Shadow loves to splash and chase after minnows. Then there's the steeper climb up to the rocky overlook, which offers breathtaking panoramic views of the surrounding countryside, especially stunning in the fall when the leaves explode in a riot of color. And then there's the old logging road, overgrown in places but still easily passable, which cuts deep into the heart of the woods, leading to a secluded little clearing where we often stop for a snack and a water break. Lately, though, our usual peaceful hikes have started to feel different. It began subtly, almost imperceptibly, with a few odd occurrences that I initially dismissed as my imagination playing tricks on me. The first time I noticed anything strange was about a month ago. We were on the logging road, heading towards our usual clearing. The air was still and quiet, the only sounds the rustling of leaves under our boots and Shadow's happy panting. Suddenly, Shadow stopped dead in his tracks, his ears perked up, a low growl rumbling in his chest. I looked around, trying to see what had caught his attention, but there was nothing there. Just the endless rows of trees, the dappled sunlight filtering through the canopy, the usual sights and sounds of the forest. "What is it, boy?" I asked. Crouching down beside him, he didn't take his eyes off something in the distance, though I couldn't see what it was. After a minute or two, he seemed to relax, shaking himself and continuing on our way, as if whatever had bothered him had vanished. I thought nothing of it at the time. Shadow sometimes gets spooked by squirrels or the occasional deer. But over the next few weeks, these incidents became more frequent and more unsettling. He would suddenly stop, growl, and stare intently into the woods, even when there was clearly nothing there. Sometimes his fur would stand on end, and he would let out a soft whine, as if he were scared. It was behavior I'd never seen from him before. Shadow is usually a happy-go-lucky dog, friendly to everyone he meets and generally unfazed by his surroundings. What made it even more disturbing was that I started experiencing strange things myself. It started with a feeling of being watched, a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, as if there were eyes on me even when I knew we were alone. Then came the sounds, faint whispers on the wind that I couldn't quite make out, the snapping of twigs when there was no animal in sight, and once a sound like something heavy dragging itself through the underbrush just out of view. At first, I tried to rationalize it all. The woods are full of sounds, and it's easy to let your imagination run wild when you're alone in the quiet. Maybe there were more animals around than I realized. Maybe the wind was playing tricks on my ears. But the feeling of unease persisted, growing stronger with each passing day. One afternoon, we were hiking on the trail along the brook, one of our usual favorites. The sun was shining, the water was gurgling peacefully, and for a while, everything felt normal. Shadow was even back to his usual playful self, chasing after butterflies and happily trotting ahead. Then, as we rounded a bend in the path, we both froze. Standing in the middle of the trail was a figure. It was tall and gaunt, its limbs unnaturally long and thin. It was draped in what looked like tattered, dark clothing, and its head was obscured by a deep hood, so I couldn't make out any features. It was completely still, silent, just standing there blocking our path. My heart pounded in my chest. I instinctively reached for Shadow, pulling him closer to my side. He was whimpering softly, his body trembling. We stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the figure, and it just stared back, or at least I assumed it was staring back. The stillness was unnerving, the silence deafening. Finally, after what felt like an age, the figure slowly turned its head to the side, as if acknowledging our presence. It made no other movement, no sound. But something about that slow, deliberate turn sent a shiver down my spine that had nothing to do with the cool afternoon air. Without a word, without even a glance at me, Shadow suddenly bolted off the trail, plunging into the dense undergrowth. He was whimpering and yelping, clearly terrified. I didn't hesitate. Whatever that thing was, I didn't want to stick around to find out. I turned and ran in the opposite direction, back the way we had come, my lungs burning, my legs aching. I didn't stop until I could see the familiar rooftops of our town through the trees. When I finally reached home, breathless and shaken, Shadow was already there, scratching at the back door, his eyes wide with fear. He wouldn't leave my side for the rest of the day, constantly nudging me with his nose and whining softly. That was a week ago. We haven't been back to the woods since. Shadow refuses to even go near the door if it's open and facing the direction of the trails. He's been clingy and anxious, constantly looking over his shoulder and barking at the slightest sound. And I haven't been sleeping well. Every time I close my eyes, I see that tall, dark figure standing silently in the middle of the path. I keep telling myself it was just someone dressed up, maybe a hiker with an odd sense of style. But deep down, I know it was more than that. There was something unnatural about its stillness, its silence, the way Shadow reacted. Something is wrong in those woods, something that has started to affect both me and my dog. And I have a terrible feeling that whatever it is, it's not done with us yet. The days that followed our encounter with the figure on the trail were filled with a palpable tension that hung heavy in the air, both inside our little house and, I could only imagine, in the woods beyond. Shadow remained unusually subdued, his tail tucked low, his eyes constantly darting around as if expecting something to jump out from the shadows. He would whine in his sleep and often press himself against me at night, seeking comfort and reassurance. As for me, the anxiety gnawed at me constantly. Every creak of the house, every rustle of leaves outside the window sent a jolt of fear through me. I found myself constantly checking the locks on the doors and windows, even in broad daylight. The feeling of being watched, which had been a subtle unease before, now felt like a tangible presence, a pair of unseen eyes boring into the back of my skull. Sleep offered little respite. My dreams were plagued by shadowy figures lurking in the trees, their forms shifting and indistinct, but their presence undeniably malevolent. I would often wake up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding, the lingering feeling of dread clinging to me like a shroud. Despite my fear, a part of me, a foolishly curious part, felt the urge to understand what we had seen. Was it just a person? Could it have been some kind of hallucination, brought on by stress or exhaustion? Or was it something else? The thought sent a shiver down my spine. I tried to distract myself. I buried myself in work, losing myself in spreadsheets and emails. I watched mindless television until my eyes felt gritty and dry. I even attempted to read a book, but my focus kept drifting back to the woods, to the silent, hooded figure that had terrified us. After a few days of this self-imposed confinement, the walls of the house started to feel like they were closing in on me. The vibrant autumn colors outside the window seemed to mock my fear, and the silence of the house, once a source of comfort, now felt oppressive. Shadow, sensing my restlessness, would nudge my hand with his wet nose, his big brown eyes filled with concern. "I know, boy," I'd say, scratching behind his ears. I don't like being cooped up either. Finally, the need to move, to feel the familiar ground beneath my feet, became too strong to ignore. I decided that we needed to go for a walk, even if it was just around the neighborhood. Anything was better than being trapped inside with my fear. Shadow seemed to sense my decision and perked up a little, his tail giving a tentative wag. I leashed him up, and we stepped out into the crisp autumn air. The familiar sights and sounds of our quiet street were a welcome change from the suffocating atmosphere of the house. Neighbors waved as we passed, and the friendly greetings helped to ease some of the tension that had been gripping me. We walked further than I had intended, our path eventually leading us to the edge of the woods. The trees stood tall and silent, their leaves rustling softly in the gentle breeze. A familiar path beckoned, the entrance now looking both inviting and menacing at the same time. Shadow stopped at the edge of the woods, his ears drooping, a low whine escaping his throat. He pulled back against the leash, clearly unwilling to venture into the trees. I knelt down beside him, stroking his fur. "It's okay, boy," I murmured. "We don't have to go in. We'll just stay here for a little while." We stood there for a few minutes, just looking at the woods. The sunlight dappled through the leaves, creating shifting patterns of light and shadow on the forest floor. It looked so peaceful, so normal. It was hard to believe that just a week ago, this same place had filled me with such terror. As I stood there, a familiar path deeper into the woods caught my eye, the one that led to our favorite clearing. A strange urge washed over me, a desire to reclaim that place, to prove to myself that it was still safe, still ours. It was a foolish thought, I knew, but it took root and began to grow. "Come on, Shadow," I said, standing up. "Just a little ways. We don't have to go far." Shadow remained hesitant, but he followed me as I stepped onto the path. We walked slowly, cautiously, our senses on high alert. The usual sounds of the forest seemed muted, as if holding their breath. The air felt heavy, charged with an unseen energy. We hadn't gone more than a few hundred feet when Shadow suddenly stopped again, his body rigid, his gaze fixed on something ahead. This time I saw it too. Standing amongst the trees, partially hidden by the foliage, were several figures. They were similar in appearance to the one we had encountered before, tall, gaunt, draped in dark clothing, their heads obscured by hoods. But now there were more of them, their silent forms scattered amongst the trees, watching us. My heart lurched into my throat. I instinctively grabbed Shadow's leash, ready to turn and run. But then I noticed something else. These figures weren't just standing there. They were moving. Slowly, deliberately, they were stepping out from behind the trees, their long, thin limbs moving with an unsettling fluidity. They were surrounding us. A wave of pure terror washed over me. This wasn't just a person in a costume. This was something else, something sinister, something that felt ancient and wrong. Shadow was whimpering uncontrollably, his body shaking violently. One of the figures, the closest one, slowly raised a hand. Its fingers were long and skeletal, the skin pale and almost translucent. As it moved, a faint, rustling sound filled the air, like dry leaves being dragged across the ground. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I turned and fled, pulling Shadow along behind me. We ran as fast as we could, our feet pounding on the forest floor, the sound of our panicked breathing filling the air. I could feel the presence of the figures behind us, though I didn't dare to look back. The feeling of being watched was now a physical weight, pressing down on me, urging me to run faster. We burst out of the woods and onto the familiar street, our lungs burning, our muscles screaming in protest. I didn't stop running until we were safely inside our house, the door locked and bolted. We huddled together in the living room, panting and trembling, our eyes wide with fear. I peered out the window, but I didn't see anything. The street was quiet, peaceful, bathed in the golden light of the late afternoon sun. It was as if nothing had happened, but I knew it had. I had seen them. They were real, and they were in the woods watching us. Over the next few days, the strange occurrences at home intensified. The whispers became clearer, though I still couldn't quite make out the words. They seemed to be coming from inside the walls, from under the floorboards, a constant low murmur that was just below the threshold of conscious hearing. Objects would move on their own. A book would fall from a shelf. A kitchen knife would be inexplicably moved from the counter to the sink. The lights would flicker for no apparent reason. Shadow would bark and growl at empty corners of the room, his fur standing on end. One evening, I was sitting in the living room trying to read when I heard a scratching sound coming from the front door. Shadow, who had been dozing at my feet, instantly sprang to his feet, growling and barking ferociously at the door. I cautiously approached the door and peered through the peephole. There was nothing there. I slowly opened the door, but the porch was empty. As I was about to close it, I noticed something on the doorstep. It was a small, intricately carved wooden figure. It was roughly shaped like a human, but its features were distorted and unsettling. Its eyes were large and hollow, and its mouth was stretched into a silent scream. A chill ran down my spine as I picked it up. It felt cold and strangely heavy in my hand. I had a sudden, overwhelming urge to throw it away, to get it out of the house. But as I turned to do so, I noticed something else. Scratched into the bottom of the figure were two letters M and S, my initials, in shadows. A cold dread washed over me, a certainty that whatever was happening was directly targeting us. We were no longer just witnesses. We were the focus of something dark and malevolent that had taken an interest in our lives. And I had no idea what it wanted. The discovery of the wooden figure with our initials confirmed my deepest fears. We were not just experiencing random strange occurrences, we were being actively targeted. The feeling of unease escalated into a constant state of low-level panic. Sleep became a rare and fragmented luxury, haunted by nightmares of hooded figures and silent, watchful eyes. The whispers in the house intensified, sometimes sounding like hushed conversations just out of earshot, other times like a single, sibilant voice murmuring my name. The objects moving on their own became more deliberate, more unsettling. One morning, I found all the kitchen knives neatly arranged on the living room floor, their sharp edges glinting in the pale morning light. Another time, I woke to find my clothes piled in a perfect pyramid in the middle of my bedroom floor. Shadow's behavior grew increasingly erratic. He would often stare intently at the walls or ceiling, barking and growling at unseen entities. He became fiercely protective of me, shadowing my every move, his ears constantly twitching, his body always tense and ready for a threat that only he seemed to perceive fully. I knew I couldn't stay in the house any longer. The oppressive atmosphere, the constant sense of being watched, was starting to take a toll on my sanity. I needed to find answers, to understand what was happening and why. But where could I even begin? My thoughts turned to the woods. As terrifying as the encounters there had been, it felt like the source of whatever was plaguing us. Perhaps if I could understand what was in those woods, I could find a way to stop it. It was a desperate plan, born out of fear and a growing sense of helplessness, but I couldn't think of anything else to do. The thought of going back into the woods filled me with dread, but the alternative, staying in my own home and slowly succumbing to whatever malevolent force was at play, was even more terrifying. I decided to go the next day. I spent the evening preparing, gathering some basic supplies, a sturdy backpack, a bottle of water, a first aid kit, and a flashlight. I also grabbed a heavy walking stick, more for psychological comfort than any real sense of protection. That night, sleep eluded me completely. I lay in bed, listening to the wind howling outside, the shadows dancing on my walls, every creak of the house amplified in the silence. Shadow lay beside me, whimpering softly, his body pressed tightly against mine. As dawn finally broke, Casting a pale light through my window, I felt a grim determination settle within me. I had to do this, for my own sake and for Shadow's. After a quick breakfast, I leashed up Shadow, who seemed surprisingly calm, perhaps sensing the change in my resolve. We stepped out of the house and onto the street. The air was crisp and cold, the sky overcast. The world outside seemed oblivious to the terror that had been brewing within the walls of my home. As we approached the edge of the woods, Shadow hesitated for a moment, then followed me onto the path. We walked in silence, our steps slow and deliberate. The woods felt different this time, heavier, more oppressive. The air was still, and the usual sounds of birdsong were absent. We followed the logging road, the path where we had first encountered the strange figures. Every shadow seemed to hold a potential threat. Every rustle of leaves made me jump. Shadow stayed close to my side, his gaze darting nervously into the trees. As we reached the clearing, the place where we used to stop for our breaks, a sense of foreboding washed over me. The clearing looked different, somehow wrong. The grass seemed withered and brown, and the trees surrounding it appeared twisted and gnarled. An unnatural silence hung in the air. Suddenly, Shadow let out a low growl, his body tensing. I followed his gaze and saw them. They were standing at the edge of the clearing, their tall, gaunt forms draped in their familiar dark clothing, their hooded heads turned towards us. There were more of them this time, their silent ranks stretching into the shadows of the trees. My heart pounded in my chest. I gripped the walking stick tightly in my hand, my knuckles white. I wanted to run, to turn and flee back the way we came, but a strange sense of resignation held me rooted to the spot. One of the figures slowly stepped forward, its long, skeletal hand reaching out towards us. It made a soft, rustling sound, like dry leaves skittering across the ground. And then it spoke. The voice was not what I expected. It was not a deep, guttural growl, nor a chilling, ethereal whisper. Instead, it was soft, almost gentle, with a strange, echoing quality to it. "You have trespassed," the figure said, its voice seeming to come from all around us. "This place is not yours."
What, we didn't know?
I stammered, my voice trembling. "We just like to hike here." The figure tilted its hooded head slightly, as if considering my words. The silence that followed stretched on, heavy and suffocating. Finally, it spoke again. "The woods are waking," it said. "Things are changing. You are not safe here anymore." Another figure stepped forward, and then another. They moved slowly, deliberately, their silent form surrounding us, closing in. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The first figure raised its hand again, its long, pale fingers pointing towards Shadow. "He senses it," it said. "He is attuned to the old ways." I looked down at Shadow, who was whimpering softly, his eyes fixed on the figures. He seemed to understand what they were saying, or at least he felt their presence in a way that I couldn't fully comprehend. "Leave him alone," I said, stepping in front of Shadow, trying to shield him with my body. The figures remained silent for a moment, their dark forms looming over us. Then the first figure spoke again, its voice taking on a slightly different tone, a hint of something ancient and sorrowful. "You are both changing," it said. "The woods have touched you. You can feel it, can't you?" And as it spoke those words, I did feel it. A strange sensation, a subtle shift within me, a growing awareness of the world around me that went beyond the ordinary senses. I could feel the pulse of the forest, the slow, steady rhythm of the ancient trees, the hidden currents of energy flowing beneath the earth. And I looked down at Shadow, and I saw it in his eyes too, a wildness, an understanding that had not been there before. The figures seemed to sense this change in us. They stepped back slightly, their silent forms still surrounding us, but their posture less threatening. "Go," the first figure said, its voice barely audible now. "Leave this place and do not return. The woods are not for you anymore." Without another word, the figures turned and melted back into the shadows of the trees, disappearing as silently and as abruptly as they had appeared. I stood there for a long moment, my heart still pounding, my mind reeling from what had just happened. Then I looked down at Shadow. He looked up at me, his eyes bright and alert, a newfound confidence in his stance. We turned and walked back the way we had come, leaving the clearing and the silent figures behind. The woods still felt different, but now there was a sense of understanding, a strange connection to the ancient energy that permeated the trees and the earth. We haven't been back to those woods since. The strange occurrences in the house have stopped, the whispers have faded, and the feeling of being watched is gone. But things are different now. Shadow is more alert, more connected to the natural world around him. And I can still feel it sometimes, a subtle awareness of the woods, a faint echo of the ancient voice. I don't know what we encountered in those woods, or what the changes within us truly mean. But I know one thing for sure, our peaceful hikes in the forests of Nova Scotia will never be the same. And a part of me wonders, with a lingering sense of unease, what will happen when the woods wake again.